What happens when the human mind fractures? When a person snaps and loses complete control? Of course, they can't be allowed to exist in normal society. But then what are we to do with them? What's the humane solution? Somerset State Correctional Hospital was built in the early 20th century, specifically as an answer to these questions. But for over 100 years, the place has been more than just a hospital. It's a warehouse for the broken and the dangerous. A modern dungeon where the walls peel like sunburned skin and the staff speaks in hushed tones about something that exists in the silence. It was here that a young, ambitious psychiatrist named Elias Thorne, eager to prove his worth in the field of mental health, challenged the rumors and legends, chalking them up to nothing more than institutional lore. But Elias's insatiable curiosity would unfortunately become his undoing. He thought he was hunting for the truth. He didn't realize he was descending into a nightmare that defied every law of science. Because in the lower ward, the most dangerous thing isn't the madness of the patients. It's something not even the human mind can comprehend. When I was a kid, way back in the 1980s, my grandparents would take us up to our family cabin near the small town of Bedford, PA. The drive from our house to the cabin was about 2 hours, and it's the most beautiful Pennsylvania countryside imaginable. Mountains, forests, dairy farms, pastures. It's breathtaking. It's a drive I highly recommend. There's another quaint little town along the route called Somerset, a little less than an hour from Bedford. A few miles outside of Somerset on Route 31 sits these weird old gothic buildings that look like they were built in the 1920s or even before that. I asked my grandfather once about the buildings, and he jokingly said, "That's the nut house. If you lose your marbles, they lock you up in there and throw away the key." Of course, once I heard that this place was an actual mental institution, my 12-year-old imagination went crazy. Every time I'd see it on our drive past, I'd picture all sorts of weird things going on in there. What you're about to listen to is something that has been floating around in my mind since I was a kid. It wasn't until now, 40-some years later, that I actually took the time to write a story based on these ideas. What I came up with is The Lower Ward. I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1. The guy looked more twerpy, if that's even a word, than Elias had imagined. His nose was a beak, a literal beak, something that might open any minute and start screaming like a crow. And the wire-rimmed glasses resting on that schnoz made him look even more peculiar, giving him a cartoon mad scientist aesthetic, complete with a lab coat. Elias smiled cordially, a smile that came from his futile attempt at containing a laugh that was dying to burst into the world. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Finch," Elias said as he crossed the room to the desk. He reached out his hand. The man stood and reached across his desk, weakly shaking Elias's hand. "Dr. Thorne, I presume. It's good to finally meet you. Trust your trip went well." Elias thought for a moment before answering. The drive to Somerset State Correctional Hospital from New York was more than simply a pleasant one. It was majestic. The Appalachian Mountain region of central Pennsylvania was a breathtaking experience during any season of the year, but in the middle of October, it was simply indescribable. I had never been through this area in a car before. The mountains and changing foliage was a sight I hadn't expected. I was speechless. Dr. Finch smiled through his pencil-thin lips. "We're quite proud of our mountains here in Somerset County." "Are you originally from here, Dr. Finch?" Elias asked. "I am, as a matter of fact," Dr. Finch said. "I consider myself blessed to have lived in this area all my life. I could have taken positions over the years in other places for much more money, but I chose to stay. I guess you could say I prefer the continuity of life here." Elias nodded. "I've moved around so much that the word continuity doesn't pertain to me." "I find that to be quite sad," Dr. Finch said. "But to each his own, I guess." He gestured to one of the two chairs in front of his desk. "Please." Elias took his seat and prepared for the orientation. This was his first day. Somerset State Correctional Hospital wouldn't be the final step of his budding career as a psychiatrist, but he was eager to make a good impression just the same. The years of schooling and residency had come to an end, and Elias Thorne was finally and officially Dr. Elias Thorne, M.D. His mother was quite proud, of course. Not as proud as if he was a surgeon, but at least her son was a doctor of something. As he looked over Dr. Finch's shoulder, Elias couldn't help but notice the old metal monstrosity in the back corner, a large black safe that looked like a relic from a forgotten century. Finch immediately took notice of where Elias's attention had strayed. He turned to the safe and in a flustered hurry closed the door and spun the combination dial to seal the deal. "I don't think I've ever seen a safe like that outside of an old movie," Elias joked. Dr. Finch smiled and let out a nervous laugh. "An artifact as old as this hospital. It's been here since the building's construction back in the early 1900s, I imagine. There's nothing in there of importance." "I thought I saw a patient file on the shelf before you closed the door," Elias said. A stern, hollow look came over Finch's face. His eyes narrowed to slits. The glare gave Elias an unexpected chill. A simple question had caused a complete change in atmosphere, filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it difficult to breathe. "Your job at this hospital is structured, Dr. Thorne," Finch said in a cold, calculated voice. "The patients are here by order of the courts. They are criminals, to put it bluntly. You must keep your focus on the job you are here to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Anything you do outside of your designated purview will be considered a dereliction of your duties and met with disciplinary actions. Is that clear?" Elias hadn't been here for more than 10 minutes, and already he was getting bitched at by the principal. Maybe the guy was a natural ballbuster, or perhaps he was the runt of the litter with a Napoleon complex. Whatever the case, he'd just stepped in shit without realizing it, and now he had to clean it off. "Yes, sir. Very clear." Dr. Finch glared at Elias for an uncomfortable moment before continuing, an act designed to drive his point home. "Each patient is dosed at breakfast with olanzapine. As you've undoubtedly learned in medical school and residency, this is a common institutional practice. Our patients are dangerous. They're criminals with good attorneys. Most of them should have been sentenced to prison or worse, but they were given a judicial commitment because their lawyers found a way to prove mental instability." "Are you suggesting they were able to fake their way out of a prison sentence, Doctor?" Elias asked. "That these patients were all savvy enough to dupe court-appointed psychiatrists?" Finch picked up Elias's resume that was already sitting in the center of his desk and looked at it. "You did your residency at the Kensington estate, I see. What that tells me is the only patients you've looked after are rich housewives with anxiety issues over which Tuckernuck outfit they plan on wearing to their dinner parties. It's not that simple here. If you turn your back on any one of these patients, they'll rip your throat out with their bare hands." Elias swallowed a mouthful of dry saliva. The optimism he had arrived with this morning was quickly diminishing. It was time to keep his opinionated mouth shut if he was going to have any success at his first real job in the psychiatry field. "Yes, sir. "No, you don't," Finch said. "You don't understand shit about this place." He picked up Elias's resume and pointed at it like it was a prop for a presentation. "This resume tells me that you've had 0 experience with unstable patients. I doubt you've had to hand out anything harder than a Xanax prescription." He tried to hold back. to let this self-righteous little prick have his moment of glory. But he couldn't. Pride is a powerful emotion, one that can either motivate you or get you into a world of trouble. I beg your pardon, Dr. Finch, but I have more clinical experience than you're giving me credit for. This might be my first job in the field, but I assure you, sir, I am well qualified. The silence actually hurt, like grabbing onto a hot fence with both hands to see how long you could hold on. At least you have a set of balls, Thorne, Finch finally said with a smile. Let's hope that's enough to get you through here. Elias let out a relaxed breath. He had held his ground and perhaps gained a modicum of respect. Where things would go from here was anyone's guess, but at least Elias had established a boundary. Hopefully that boundary would be respected. The safe caught his eye again, but he dared only look at it for a split second. That thing seemed to be the catalyst for the tension that had erupted between them. Elias definitely didn't want that shitstorm to swell up again. On the door of your office is a bin where you'll find your census sheet attached to a metal clipboard, Dr. Finch said. This is the list of patients you will be responsible for during your first quarter of employment here. These patients are code green, the lowest threat level. Today, you will shadow me as I introduce you to these patients and conduct their sessions. Tomorrow, they belong to you. Quarter 2 is when you will be introduced to code yellow patients, the next higher threat level. You will not need to interact with code red patients until you've been here for a year and have gone through all the proper security protocols and procedures. Dr. Finch stood, smiled, and extended his hand for a shake. Take 30 minutes to get acquainted with your office and look over your census sheet. I'll come by to retrieve you when I'm ready to start the rounds. Elias shook the man's hand, which was still one of the weakest handshakes he'd ever felt. Thank you, Doctor. I'm looking forward to working at Somerset and working alongside of you. Yeah, Finch said, looking down his long nose. Let's see if you have that same optimism a month from now. As Elias walked the corridor to his office, his mind would not leave the ancient safe in Finch's office. There were files in that box being hidden away from the light of the world. Files that held secrets, information, knowledge even. Yes, he was told to forget about it, but being the Elias Thorne he always was, curious, eager, hungry for a mystery, forgetting about that safe wasn't an option. It never was. Chapter 2. You're just the man I need to see, Elias said to the weathered old janitor who was mopping the floor in the staff lounge. Huh? The man replied with a look of surprise. His thick gray Wilford Brimley mustache seemed to move independently of his mouth. Harold, right? Elias asked. You're the head of maintenance? That's me, Harold said. You must be that new doctor everyone's talking about. I've been working the late shift this week, so I haven't run into you yet. Elias reached out his hand for a handshake. Well, it's good to finally meet you. I hear you're the man who knows everything about everything around here. Harold laughed. I might know a little bit about this place. Been working here 40 years. Elias's eyes widened. That means you started at Somerset 5 years before I was born. Yeah, I figured you were somewhere in your mid-30s, Harold said. The fluorescent lights above fluttered for a few seconds, then made a humming sound like an insect being fried in a bug zapper. Harold did his best to keep the staff lounge clean, but a room in a building that was over 100 years old came with a unique set of challenges. The linoleum floor was cracked and gouged from years of foot traffic. The coffee pot on the counter was at least 25 years old. The thing didn't even have a built-in clock. The microwave looked like a relic left over from the 1980s, and the TV hanging on the wall was literally black and white, with big round dials and metal antennas sticking out of the back of it. There was no budget money appropriated for this room. No one cared or took an interest in having a nice place for the staff to grab a cup of coffee and unwind. Someone did put a small cluster of flowers in a vase by the window, but they had died and dried up months ago, making the room look even more desolate. "How you liking the place so far?" Harold asked. Elias smiled. "It's been an interesting week. I'll just leave it at that." "That's a nice way of putting it," Harold said. There was coffee in the pot, and the light was on, barely, indicating the thing was warm, but the black liquid contained in the glass certainly didn't look or smell like anything Elias wanted to put in his body. He imagined it would be more of a coffee-flavored paste than a liquid, something burnt and chewy. "I can make a fresh pot if you'd like," Harold said, noticing Elias's face as he stared at the pot. I think I'm good," Elias said. "Are you sure? You might need a good caffeine boost to get you through your first night shift." "Okay, Harold," Elias said, taking a seat in one of the mismatched metal chairs. "You talked me into it." He looked around, taking in the poor aesthetics of the room. Would he eventually have enough pull around here to get this room redecorated? Shouldn't be too much to ask to have a nice place for the staff to relax when a break was needed, especially in a state correctional hospital where the stress levels were always high. He watched Harold make the coffee. The man moved slowly but efficiently, a sign that the years of labor had taken a toll on his old bones. "You like it rich, Doc?" Harold asked. "An extra scoop to bump up the heart rate?" "I'll leave it up to you, Harold," Elias said. "Robust it is, then." As Elias waited for his coffee, he remembered something he had wanted to ask when he finally met Harold. He had overheard 2 staff members talking earlier in the week and had heard them mention a lower ward. When he had asked what that was, the 2 staff members brushed it off and acted like they didn't know what he was talking about. He had asked others the same question this week, and everyone looked at him like he was crazy. Maybe he had heard the wrong thing and there was actually no such place. But if there was, the head of maintenance, a man who had been here for 40 years, would definitely know something about it. "That's going to take a few minutes," Harold said as he came over to the table where Elias was sitting. "The old coffee pot takes a while to get going. Mind if I sit?" "Please," Elias said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Harold sat down with a heavy sigh. "My wife died 5 years ago." "Oh my, Harold. I'm so sorry to hear that," Elias said. The old man held up a hand. No, Doc. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just mentioned that because I was about to tell you my story. See, I was going to retire a while back before Mary died. We were going to get an RV and run the country like retired people do for the rest of our lives. But then she up and croaked. So I decided not to retire after all. I'm too much of a busy bee to sit around by myself drinking beer in a reclining chair. My only other option to keep busy would be to get a job as a greeter at Walmart, but who in their right friggin' mind would want to do something like that? Dr. Finch said I could stay here working as long as I was able and it wasn't harmful to my health. I know he can be a prick sometimes, but he's all right underneath. It's definitely good to keep busy, Elias said. So many people retire and fade away because they have nothing to do. The mind is always looking for problems to solve or things to create. It does that until the body draws its last breath. Yeah, I guess you'd know all about the mind, being a psychiatrist and all, Harold said. Elias smiled. Speaking of problems to solve, I wanted to ask you something. Earlier this week, I heard a couple of staff members mention a lower ward, but I didn't see anything like that in the hospital directory or floor plan. You know anything about it? Harold's face went pale. Who told you about that? Well, no one told me. I overheard it. The man's hands began to tremble and his breathing increased. He hastily got up from his seat and began rushing for the door. On the way to the exit, he accidentally kicked over a small metal chair. Whoa, Harold. Hang on a second, Elias said, rising from his seat. You just forget you heard about that nonsense, Harold said, fumbling to pick up the fallen chair. Elias walked over to help with the chair. "Harold, stop." They both stood and looked at each other. "Take a breath and calm down right now. Doctor's orders." Harold took several deep breaths, but the color still hadn't returned to his face. "What's gotten into you?" Elias asked. The man's lips quivered as he searched for his words. "There's something in the silence, Doc. Sometimes it comes through the vents." Elias squinted. "Silence comes through the vents?" "Well, when the air isn't blowing through them, what else is there but silence, Harold?" "It's not just the silence, Doc. It's what's in the silence." "Harold, there is nothing in silence," Elias said. "It's just a word used to describe the absence of sound. If there's no sound, you're left with silence. There can't be anything embedded in that. You're not making any sense." "Give it a few weeks. You'll understand," Harold said. "It's not a sound or a whisper. It's a knowing. Information forced on you that you don't want. Do yourself a favor, Doc. When you get that feeling, and you'll know it when it comes, take a walk outside, no matter how cold or rainy it is. Step outside and have a smoke." "A smoke?" Elias asked. "You can't smoke on the property of a state hospital." It took him a moment, but he recalled seeing several people smoking in the back parking lot of the facility. At first he thought they were vaping, a common trendy habit these days. But he soon realized they were smoking actual cigarettes, something that could easily cost $10 a pack these days. "Why would you advise me to smoke, Harold? That's not something people do anymore." "It's a reason to get out of the building and clean your head out," Harold said. "You'd be surprised how many people pick up the habit after working here for a while." He turned quickly and left the room, pausing to look back once before hustling away. Elias listened to Harold's rushed footsteps fade for a moment before he turned and walked over to the window. Looking out onto the hospital grounds below, he had a profound thought. Harold had been working in a facility for the criminally insane for 40 years. Of course, that would promote an undercurrent of superstition. It had probably festered like an open sore in that poor man for decades. There's something in the silence. What the hell was he even thinking? Chapter 3. There's a common word that comes to mind when describing Somerset State Correctional Hospital: dilapidated. Did the state of Pennsylvania just not give half a shit about this place? Was it because of the type of patients being treated here? Sure, they were a dangerous part of the population who had, by their own actions, proven to be unfit to live in society. But they were still human beings. Would it hurt to throw a coat of paint on the wall here and there? Almost every wall in this dingy building was peeling like sunburnt skin, loaded with lead and asbestos, no doubt. Elias was entering his 3rd week as a staff psychiatrist, and by this point, he couldn't tell which was more dismal, the patients or the surroundings. He had initially planned on spending an obligatory 2 years at Somerset before moving on to greener pastures. But as each day droned on in this godforsaken purgatory, he had resolved to give these fuckers no more than a year of his life before splitting. Even a person with a commanding knowledge of the human mind would find it hard to maintain sanity in this modern dungeon. It was his day to monitor and observe patient demeanor in the recreation room. There was a lot to be learned from watching the patients interact with each other outside of sessions. They were sedated, of course, but they were still individuals who were prone to individual behavior. Elias walked around the room, studying the interactions without taking written notes. He wanted the patients to feel like he was just hanging out, not there to study them. And they were beginning to warm up to the new shrink just fine. He had a calmness about him that was authentic, not forced. The other staff doctors were mostly stiff, like they all had the same size board shoved up their asses. But the young Dr. Thorne was nothing like that. He cared, really, and that got results. 4 security guards and 1 nurse made up the other staff in the room, watching over about 15 patients. The nurse, Nurse Winters, was handing out medication in small cups with a chaser of water. This particular cocktail of meds was prescribed by Dr. Finch himself, especially designed to keep the patients calm and manageable. The result was a classic Thorazine shuffle. Zombies, for lack of a better word. In the far corner of the room stood a large metal cabinet where the staff stored board games and art supplies. The door was left open enough that Elias noticed something sticking out from between two puzzle boxes. A large sheet of old paper. At first he was indifferent to it, but the thing kept catching his eye, enough so that he had to make a trip over to investigate. His first reaction when he removed it was that it didn't make much sense. What would a highly rendered architectural drawing be doing mixed in with patient art, games, and puzzles? The drawing was so detailed and perfect it looked like it was made by an architect, not a mental patient. There were no former architects in the ward that he was aware of. Maybe this was a relic left over from a patient long gone, and it was just stuffed in the back of this cabinet years ago. Or most likely, it was a real blueprint that had somehow accidentally mixed in with patient art. God only knows how that could have happened, but it was still plausible. The detail was astonishing. A full architectural rendering of Somerset State Correctional Hospital. Every room completely rendered, even the number of toilets in the bathrooms. Not a single nuance was spared. The thing that stood out most to Elias in this unbelievable drawing was a section labeled Lower Ward. What he had thought and had been told only existed in rumor and legend was finally illustrated in an official-looking document. Here it was, the proof he needed to investigate further. Excitement coursed through his veins and a smile widened in his cheeks. Nurse Winters had finished handing out her pills and was organizing her med cart. Elias rushed over to her, gripping the rendering in his hand, doing his best not to draw attention. "Do you have a minute, nurse?" She looked at the doctor for a moment, attempting to discern his intentions. "Is there a problem, Dr. Thorne?" "Problem? Huh? Oh, no, nothing like that," Elias said. "I just wanted to get your opinion on something." The nurse, slightly apprehensive, nodded in agreement, and the two stepped out into the hallway. "What can I help you with, doctor?" Elias opened the drawing and held it up for her to see. "Have you seen this drawing before?" Nurse Winters squinted for a moment, then laughed. "Yes, I've seen many of these drawings before. That was made by Catatonic John." "Who?" "John Simmons," she said. "He used to be a patient here. Well, he was a guard here first, before he went nuts and killed his wife and 2 children. He was committed to Somerset by reason of insanity. He died in his room about 5 years ago." "Where did that name come from?" The nurse gave Elias a blank look. "He was catatonic." Elias laughed sarcastically. "Come on, nurse. Are you suggesting a catatonic made a rendering this detailed? Catatonia doesn't work that way." Nurse Winters looked at the drawing in Elias's hand. She shivered, then crossed her arms to fight off a chill that had suddenly come over her. "I actually saw him drawing this." She looked around to make sure they were alone. "You might think I'm as nutty as our patients, doctor, but, well, I watched John draw this thing without even looking at the paper." She let out a sudden deep sigh. His left hand was using the pencil like it was being guided, while John just stared off into space, drooling all over himself. "What, like automatic obedience?" Elias asked. "You think he was compelled to draw this from someone's suggestion? Because that's the only way a catatonic would be able to make a cognitive drawing." The nurse's face went pale. "I'm sure that's possible, Dr. Thorne, but whoever was suggesting this to him was someone only John could see. There was never anyone near him when he drew." Whether it was the way she told the story or the thought of a drooling catatonic being guided to draw such a detailed rendering, Elias began to feel the same chill in the air that had affected Nurse Winters. "You should probably tuck that thing back in the closet and forget you ever saw it," the nurse said. "Okay, so why would I do that?" Elias asked. She cocked her head slightly and gave Elias a scornful look. "Because, doctor, there are things in this hospital better left alone. Do your job every day and go home. Nothing more. It's the only way to survive here." Elias wanted to continue the conversation, but Nurse Winters didn't give him the chance. She hurried off before he could say another word. The drawing suddenly felt cold in his hand, like he was holding a piece of jagged ice. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and put it in his lab coat pocket. Chapter 4. The desk lamp cast a harsh, circular spot on Elias's desk, leaving the rest of the room darkened in shadow. He should have gone home at the end of his shift an hour ago, but something still ate at him, gnawing at the back of his mind like a parasite with sharp, gnashing teeth. There was a secret hidden in the depths of this hospital, one the staff seemed desperate to suppress. But why? Why go to these extreme measures to hide an entire section of the hospital? If it was a closed-off, broken-down wing in complete disrepair, that would be fine. But to deny its existence altogether? It seemed ridiculous. Perhaps it had something to do with John Simmons. Catatonic John, as Nurse Winters had so casually called him. Elias imagined that whole affair had cast a black cloud over Somerset, one that made everyone involved look incompetent. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. John Simmons went missing for 48 hours until he was found in a sort of fugue state down in the basement. The staff doctors had checked him out and said he was fine, but he was not fine. Not by a long shot. Just a few hours after they had released him, he butchered his wife and kids. No one at the hospital was found liable for Mr. Simmons' actions, but it couldn't have resonated well in the community. Elias cleaned off the files and paperwork that had been cluttering his desk all week, giving him an open space to work with. He then pulled out the blueprint rendering he had found in the art supplies closet and unfolded it across his desktop. The drawing still amazed him. An image flashed in his mind, one planted there by that half-crazed nurse. A catatonic patient, staring off into nothing, drooling all over his chin and chest, drawing this incredible illustration while not even looking at the paper. Could it have been automatic obedience? Was catatonic John influenced to draw by someone else's suggestion? Nurse Winters said she'd seen him drawing it, alone. For automatic obedience to be a viable explanation, someone would have had to have been sitting right next to him, giving him verbal commands. Of course, the nurse could have been lying, concocting some absurd ghost story for her own amusement. Let's all fuck with the new guy. It'll be great. No, Elias was a pretty perceptive guy. If someone was messing with him, he'd have picked up on it right away. So what was it then? The lower ward? A place of legend? A place everyone denied even existed? Unless this drawing was to be taken at face value. The hidden section was clearly marked in the drawing, right below the basement level, complete with 3 cells marked 700, 701, and 702. Something unusual glared up at him from the paper as he stared at it. The number 701 was a different color. The rest of the drawing was done in black ink, but that particular number looked brown, almost rust-colored. Elias ran his index finger over the number and noticed it felt bumpy. He lowered his face closer to the page for a better perspective and soon had a thought that made him shiver. The number was written in blood, dried blood that had gone from red to rust brown over the years. "Shit," Elias whispered aloud, leaning back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling. Who was this catatonic John person? Was he more than some maniac who committed familicide? Did the idea that he was influenced to make this drawing, and possibly influenced to kill his family, hold any merit? Well, no, of course not. Elias closed his eyes and shook his head. He cursed himself for having the thought. Possession. Here was a man of science, a doctor of psychiatric medicine, entertaining the thought that a human being was possibly possessed by a spirit or entity and influenced to do horrible things. The devil made me do it was not a defense in the modern world, nor did it belong in the field of medicine. John Simmons was nothing more than some asshole who snapped and killed innocent people. But what about the drawing? Elias folded up the drawing and put it in his desk drawer, then opened his laptop and logged into the hospital patient files. A search for John Simmons quickly returned the file he was looking for. There were two pictures of the guy that immediately appeared on screen. The first was Simmons, looking clean-cut and cheerful, wearing his hospital security uniform. This was clearly the employee image from the man's security swipe card. The second hardly looked like the same person at all. It was John Simmons, all right, but he was disheveled, nearly beyond recognition. His hair was long, greasy, and messy. He had a patchy gray beard and deep wrinkles around his eyes and cheeks. But that wasn't the worst of it. Elias had to blink a few times as he stared into the eyes staring back at him from the image. He knew this was just a trick of his mind, his imagination getting the best of him. But he could swear the eyes looking back at him completely lacked any vestige of humanity. They were the eyes of a beast, a creature who would patiently wait in silence for the perfect moment to rip his victim's throat out with his teeth. He shivered. Something about Simmons really got to him. Elias had completed all the medical schooling, training, and clinical study necessary to hold the title of MD, so he had seen his fair share of lunatics, but none of them had the look of John Simmons. This man should not have existed in the natural world. He was a despicable horror who had once freely walked the earth. Elias had never seen, or even imagined for that matter, someone so vile. The rest of the file told an extended version of the horror story Nurse Winters had given him earlier. During the hearing, Simmons was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial and remanded to life at Somerset State Correctional Hospital, the place he had once guarded. Another thing in the file that stood out was that Dr. Finch was the doctor who had checked Simmons out and cleared him to go home after he'd been missing for 48 hours. That little detail didn't really surprise Elias. The more he got to know Finch, the less he thought of the man and his so-called skills. The main thing Elias took away from the file, aside from the face of this monster, was where Simmons was eventually found after his missing 48 hours. They had discovered him in the basement boiler room, and according to the detailed architectural drawing this man had made, this hidden lower ward was right under the spot where he was found. Was Simmons looking for this place? Had he found it? What's down there? Elias closed his laptop and stared at the yellow circle of light on his desk. He had no business poking around in all of this. Just do the fucking job you were hired for and go home. How hard could it be? Besides, he had already resolved to give this place only a year of his life before moving on. If he were to show up for work every day, put in his best, then leave next year, he could probably live happily ever after, right? For most people, that was the only rational option. But for Elias Thorne, it wasn't so simple. Chapter 5. Ink blots. The most benign, mundane test a mental health professional can use to determine a patient's state of mind. Elias hated these things. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the Rorschach test was an important part of psychoanalysis. But today, the test was more a waste of time than anything, or so Dr. Thorne believed. He honestly didn't want to use this method on his patient today. It was Dr. Finch's idea. Even though Elias was supposed to have the final say on what treatment methods he used with his assigned patients, Finch still needed to have his bony little fingers involved. A man trying to prove he had a bigger dick. Elias placed the first card on the table and waited for his patient to study the odd shape. William, a low-risk, benign patient who was eager to cooperate, smiled as he stared at the black splotch. "Butterfly," William said, like an excited student answering a difficult question. "That's good, William," Elias said. "Was that the right answer?" William asked. Elias smiled. "Well, there is no right or wrong answer. Your interpretation of the shape is what matters. What you see is the only answer." William looked at the card again. "Yeah, I still see a butterfly." Elias couldn't help but smile. Talking with William Tucker was like having a dialogue with an 8-year-old child who was excited to be talking to an adult. However, he was under no misconception about who this patient was and what he had done to wind up in Somerset Correctional. 10 years ago, William had beat another man nearly to death with a metal chair. His lawyer had attempted to make a self-defense argument, but when the prosecution offered mental instability and a stint at Somerset as a plea deal, William's attorney jumped on it. The ink splotch on the next card was more erratic and random than the first. Elias slid it across the table and paid close attention to William's face as he studied the image. After a few moments, the patient expressed a smile which he tried to contain, then a giggle, then an all-out laugh. Elias couldn't help but laugh with him. "What?" he asked. "What's so funny?" William covered his mouth with his hand, doing his best to smother the laugh. His eyes began to water and his cheeks turned rosy red. "William," Elias said, now laughing along with his patient, "what are you laughing at?" The patient lowered his hand for a quick second, then covered his mouth again after he spoke. "It looks like poop." There was no chance of hiding it. Elias burst into a hearty laughter right along with William. It was something he had needed without realizing it. This moment of levity had sparked a light in this otherwise dark place, making the atmosphere feel much less foreboding. The constant dark cloud that hung over Somerset had no power over a good laugh. The light mood was suddenly interrupted by flickering overhead lights. They sputtered a few times, then went out altogether, plunging the room into shadow. "Shit," Elias said, looking up at the ceiling. He didn't feel like he was in danger being stuck in a dark room with William, especially after their lighthearted moment, but the situation still wasn't ideal. William didn't make a sound in the darkness, nor did he move. His silhouette was vaguely outlined by the fading daylight coming from the room's only window. What felt like an eternity was actually less than 30 seconds. The lights flickered twice, then came back to full strength, causing Elias to squint for a moment as his eyes readjusted. After a few blinks, he focused on William. What he saw caused him to jump in his seat. The look on William's face was nothing like the happy, jovial person he was just a minute ago. His eyes were wide and dark, with fully dilated pupils. A smile full of teeth stretched the length of his face, but there was nothing pleasing about this expression. It was the sneer of a predator who had cornered his prey and was relishing its fear before delivering the finishing blow. His breath was deep, slow, and calculated, adding to the look of a man who had suddenly become a beast. "William?" Elias said softly, without confidence. The patient took a few long breaths while continuing to stare at Elias. "You've located the room, Dr. Thorne. The discovery is nearly complete." "What?" Elias whispered. "All you have to do is take the final step." "William, what are you talking about?" Elias asked. William's grin became a scowl of rage, and his wide eyes narrowed, harshly focusing on Elias, glaring through him. "Take the final step, Elias. Enter the room. Expose the secret. Free yourself." Images flashed in Elias's mind. The blueprint drawing, The lower ward, room 701, marked in blood. He broke out in a cold shiver as sweat trickled down the back of his neck. His heart pounded and threatened to break out from behind his ribcage. "Free yourself, Elias." Dr. Thorne jumped up from his chair, grabbed his notes and stuffed them into his satchel. "We're finished for today, William. You may go back to the recreation room now." He hustled out of the room, looking back over his shoulder twice. William stared at Elias as he hurried away, his look never changing. "Is everything okay, Doctor?" a security guard asked as Elias rushed by in the hall. Elias didn't answer. Chapter 6. What could be better for the soul than an order of Kung Pao chicken, a glass of Pinot Noir, and Miles Davis's Kind of Blue playing in the background? On a day like Elias Thorne was having, the answer was nothing. Nothing could be better. Nothing on earth right now could remotely come close to the sweet heat of Kung Pao, the subtle, delightful flavor of Pinot Noir, and the unmatched talent and creativity of the Dark Prince of Jazz. After Elias had unpacked and plated his takeout order, he popped the cork on the Pinot, let it breathe for a bit, a moment that felt like a mouth-watering eternity, then poured a healthy glass. He inhaled slowly with his nose inside the tilted stemware. The aroma poured into his nostrils and rejuvenated his soul with the power of a baptism. His eyes instinctively closed in ecstasy. The only thing he knew of that could remotely come close to this moment was that blowjob he'd received from Renee Thompson during his freshman year of college. She sure left her mark on him that night, a mark that could never be erased, not even with therapy. For the first half of the meal, his mind was unusually calm, focused solely on the food, the wine, and the music. That perfect combination was meditative, cleaning his thoughts with the efficiency of a Buddhist monk. But, sadly, his calm state of mind didn't last. As he tilted his head back for another sip of Pinot, he caught a glimpse of something from the corner of his eye. The leather satchel. It was a gift from his parents when he was accepted into med school, something he proudly carried with him every day since. But tonight the sacred bag held a piece of paper that had caused Elias an unnecessary load of worry and concern. The goddamn thing shouldn't have been there in the first place, but being the curious idiot that Elias was, he couldn't resist bringing it home with him. Why did he have to do something so stupid? He could have left the fucking thing in his desk, forgot about it like any normal sane person would do. But that wasn't Elias Thorne. No, he had to do something stupid and bring that cursed thing home so it could invade his private life and fill his sanctuary with anxiety and dread. He took another bite of Kung Pao, but it didn't hold the same value as it had just moments ago. It was like his mind had decided to shut off his dopamine receptors and divert all the focus to the satchel and that damn drawing that had made its way into his personal space. Even the music of Miles Davis playing through his surround sound system didn't feel the same. Almost like the notes were off or out of tune now. For a brief moment, Elias swore he heard a noise coming from the leather bag, a kind of low-frequency hum. What was happening? Did the wine have some sort of adverse effect on him? He'd only had half a glass. He shook his head, hoping to stop the hypnotic state that was coming on. The drawing flashed in his mind for a split second, long enough for him to throw his relaxing evening down the drain and open this can of spoiled, rotting meat. Elias got up and went to the satchel. He didn't have to search the bag for long. The drawing was front and center, on top of all his other paperwork, like it had festered its way to the top the way a pustule does under the skin. The thing looked different to him in this kitchen light, more detailed, more professional, if that was even possible. He hated it, but he had no choice in the matter now. He was going to get to the bottom of things, and that's all there was to it. After he had unfolded the paper and stretched it out over his kitchen island, he stood back, getting a bird's-eye perspective. The lower ward stood out to him immediately, along with cell number 701, clearly written in blood. Instead of viewing it as patient art, as he had done earlier today, he now considered it an actual blueprint, an official document made for official use. This would make the lower ward more than just institutional lore. If the drawing was to be considered valid, then there really was something down there under the basement section, under the boiler room. Elias stared at the blueprint. What he didn't realize was that 3 hours had gone by in the blink of an eye. For 3 hours he had been transported inside the map, walking the basement, the boiler room, and through the door to the lower ward. He had felt the cold, damp chill, tasted the mildew in the air, and smelled the rot oozing from the walls. Whether it was his imagination or something else, he couldn't be sure, but he honestly felt as if he had been there. Now he was certain this place existed, no question. His vision was too real to merely be a hallucination or a trick of the mind. "This is such bullshit," Elias said aloud. He couldn't allow this sort of thing to ruin his life. He was a doctor of psychiatric medicine. There was a damn diploma in his office hanging on the wall and a nameplate on the door that agreed. So what the hell? Hallucinations? That just wasn't possible. Something else was at play here, something metaphysical. But that thought was even more ridiculous than a simple trick of the mind. In a futile attempt to put the day and the drawing behind him, Elias went to bed. A good night's sleep was a logical cure for most problems. Let the brain rest and rebuild overnight, right? Everything should be right with the world again by morning. That may have been possible if he had slept. Instead, he just stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. Chapter 7. The Saturday evening shift change at Somerset State Correctional Hospital was a thing of chaotic beauty. Orderlies exchanging half-hearted nods with their replacements, weekend nurses rushing to escape while dropping patient updates like breadcrumbs, and the security guards performing their practice dance of boredom and vigilance. Elias leaned against the nurse's station counter, pretending to review a patient file while actually watching the exodus. Perfect timing. The weekend skeleton crew meant fewer eyes to notice a psychiatrist who had no legitimate reason to be here on a Saturday night, especially one carrying a satchel that contained a stolen architectural drawing and a heavy-duty flashlight. Elias hadn't slept. Not a single damn minute since he'd spread that thing across his kitchen counter last night. Dark smudges had taken up permanent residence beneath his eyes, but the lack of sleep had done nothing to dull his resolve. If anything, the exhaustion had stripped away his usual professional caution, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of curiosity that just wouldn't stop firing. Through the large windows of the administrative wing, the setting sun cast long shadows across the linoleum floor, painting the normally sterile hallway in shades of amber. Elias checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. Dinner service would begin in 13 minutes, creating the perfect distraction. He patted his leather satchel, feeling the outline of catatonic John's drawing beneath the worn leather. The image of it had burned itself into his retinas, appearing whenever he closed his eyes. The meticulous layout of Somerset, the perfectly rendered rooms, and most disturbingly, that section labeled the lower ward, with cell number 701 marked in what appeared to be actual blood. "Going to be here all night, Dr. Thorne?" The voice startled him. Elias looked up to see Nurse Miller, a middle-aged woman with perpetually pursed lips and suspicious eyes. Unlike Nurse Winters, who'd warned him about the drawing, Miller was all procedure, no imagination. "Oh, I'm just wrapping up some paperwork," he lied, tapping the folder in his hands. "Finch wants to see these evaluations by Monday morning." Miller raised an eyebrow. "On a Saturday? They don't pay overtime here, you know." "Tell me about it." Elias forced a laugh that sounded hollow, even to his own ears. But he's got me by the professional balls, so here I am. The nurse's face softened slightly at his crude joke. Good. Crude humor always worked with the overworked staff. It made him seem more human and less like management. Well, don't stay too late. This place gets weird after dark. She gathered her purse from behind the counter. The weekend staff is a skeleton crew at best. Half of them spend their shifts sleeping in the supply closets. Oh, I'll be out of here in an hour, Elias said, adding another lie to the growing pile. Just need to finish these notes. Miller nodded, apparently satisfied, and headed toward the exit. Elias watched her go, counting to 60 in his head before moving. The truth was, Dr. Finch hadn't asked for any evaluations. Elias hadn't even brought any patient files with him. His satchel contained only 3 things: the architectural drawing, a heavy maglite flashlight, and a protein bar in case this little expedition ran longer than expected. What the hell was he even doing? This was career suicide if he got caught snooping around restricted areas of the hospital. 3 weeks into the job, and here he was, risking everything. For what? A drawing made by some catatonic patient who had murdered his family? A rumor about a hidden ward beneath the building? And yet, here he was. William's words from yesterday echoed in his mind. Free yourself, Elias. The sudden change in William's demeanor, those dilated pupils and that predatory smile. It was like someone else had been speaking through him, someone who knew about the drawing, someone who knew Elias had found it. The sound of rattling metal carts echoed from the corridor leading to the patient wings. Perfect timing. Elias had slipped his folder into his satchel and headed into the opposite direction, toward the service stairs that led to the basement. He had studied the hospital's official floor plans earlier that day, comparing them to John's drawing. The discrepancies were subtle but unmistakable. According to the official plans, the basement housed only maintenance equipment, the boiler room, and storage. According to John's drawing, there was something else. Elias glanced over his shoulder before pushing through the heavy door marked Authorized Personnel Only. No one saw him. The stairwell was lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast a sickly green glow over the concrete steps. The smell changed immediately. The sterile, antiseptic air of the upper floors gave way to something damper, mustier, the scent of wet limestone and neglect. Each step downward felt like a deliberate choice to leave rational thought behind. The doctor in him, the one with the framed degrees and the professional reputation, screamed for him to turn around. But that other part of him, that one that had always been fascinated by the darker corners of the human mind, pushed him forward. His footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell. Halfway down, the ambient hospital sounds from above faded entirely, replaced by the low hum of machinery below. The temperature dropped with each step until Elias could see his breath forming in small clouds in front of his face. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he felt something else, a vibration. Not from the machinery, but something deeper, something that seemed to resonate through the foundation of the building itself. A low-frequency thrum that he had felt in his teeth and bones rather than in his eardrums. The basement corridor stretched before him, dimly lit by bare bulbs spaced too far apart. Pipes ran along the ceiling, occasionally dripping condensation onto the concrete floor. The walls were old here, made of fitted stone blocks rather than drywall and plaster of the upper floors. This part of the building predated the rest of Somerset by decades, maybe longer. Elias pulled out his flashlight, but didn't turn it on yet. The existing light was poor, but sufficient enough to navigate. He reached into his satchel and retrieved John's drawing, unfolding it carefully. According to this, the main boiler room should be at the end of this corridor, and beyond that. He followed the corridor, passing storage rooms filled with ancient medical equipment and dusty files. The vibration grew stronger as he walked, and finally he could hear the boilers, a mechanical heartbeat pumping heat through the building's arteries. The boiler room door was massive, made of steel with a small reinforced glass window. Elias peered through it before entering. The room beyond was cavernous, filled with hulking shapes of industrial boilers and water heaters. Steam hissed from various valves, creating a misty atmosphere that diffused the already dim light. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The heat was immediate and oppressive after the cool corridor, causing sweat to bead on his forehead within seconds. The noise was overwhelming. The constant rumble of the boilers, the hiss of steam, the clank of pipes expanding and contracting with heat. Elias pulled out the drawing again, holding it up to compare it with the surroundings. According to the official floor plans, this boiler room was the end of the line, nothing beyond but the foundation walls. But according to John's drawing, there should be another door, one that led to a staircase descending even further beneath the hospital. He moved methodically through the boiler room, checking each wall, each corner. The space was cluttered with maintenance equipment, tool cabinets, and spare parts. Along the far wall, several industrial laundry gurneys were stacked haphazardly, apparently abandoned. Elias approached them, noticing they seemed to be pushed against the wall in a way that looked deliberate rather than random. It took considerable effort to move the heavy metal carts, but once he'd shifted them aside, he found what he was looking for. Set into the stone wall was an iron door, shorter than standard height and much older than anything else in the room. The metal was rusted at the edges, and there was no modern handle, just an ancient-looking keyhole and a simple iron pull ring. "Son of a bitch," Elias whispered, his voice lost in the mechanical cacophony of the boiler room. It was real. The lower ward existed. This had to be it. He tried the iron pull ring, pulling with increasing force, but the door was locked. Of course it was locked. Why would the entrance to a secret ward be left open? Elias stepped back, sweeping his flashlight beam across the surrounding area. If there was a door, there had to be a key. Methodically, he began searching the boiler room, opening cabinets, checking under equipment, looking for anything that might hide a key. After 20 frustrating minutes, he noticed a small rusted lockbox mounted on the wall near the electrical panels. It blended so perfectly with the general decay of the room that he'd missed it on his first inspection. The lockbox was secured with a simple latch that had nearly rusted solid. Elias used a screwdriver from a nearby toolbox to pry it open. Inside was a single iron key, heavy and primitive compared to the modern keys used elsewhere in the hospital. He held it up to the light, examining its simple but substantial design. "No fucking way it's this easy," he muttered, returning to the hidden door. Before inserting the key, Elias pressed his ear against the cold iron surface. What he heard, or thought he heard, sent a chill through him despite the boiler room's heat. There was a sound coming from the other side. A sound that couldn't possibly exist in a sealed room beneath a hospital. It was the sound of wind, not the mechanical airflow from the vents or fans, but actual whistling wind, like an open space exposed to the elements. And underneath that, something else. Voices? Not distinct enough to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably human speech. Multiple voices whispering a conversation. Elias pulled back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a doctor, a man of science. There had to be a rational explanation for what he was hearing. Air moving through old ventilation shafts, water rushing through pipes, his own overtired mind playing tricks on him. It had to be something like that, right? His hand trembled slightly as he inserted the ancient key into the lock. It fit perfectly, though it took some jiggling before he felt the mechanism engage. With a grunt and a touch of effort, he turned the key clockwise, feeling increasing resistance until, with a heavy clunk that he felt rather than heard, the lock released. Elias slipped the key into his pocket and grasped the iron ring. It took both hands and the full weight of his body to get the door moving. The hinges, likely unused for God only knew how long, screamed in protest as the heavy door swung outward. Beyond the now open threshold lay absolute darkness. Elias aimed his flashlight into the void, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending steeply downward. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying a smell that made Elias recoil. Not just the expected mustiness of an abandoned space, but something else, something organic and wrong. The smell of decay, but also of something alive. The wind he'd heard was stronger now with the door open, a steady current of air flowing upward from the darkness below. And the whispers, they were clearer now, though still indecipherable. A constant susurration that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every rational instinct told Elias to close the door, replace the key, and forget he'd ever found this place. His career, his reputation, his very understanding of reality all depended on him walking away right now. But William's words came back to haunt him again. Enter the room. Expose the secret. Free yourself. He noticed an old light bulb in the ceiling of the landing, just above his head. A quick look around the open threshold with his flashlight gave him a find he never expected. A light switch. Well, not a light switch anyone in this century had ever seen. The thing was easily 100 years old. He hesitated before clicking the ancient rotary switch, which was a porcelain knob that you had to click clockwise to engage. There was no telling if the thing was going to nail him with 110 volts as soon as he engaged it. After another glance into the abyss looming ahead of him, though, Elias decided to take the risk. Even a few old light bulbs would be better than just his flashlight. As luck would have it, Elias didn't absorb a dose of electricity when he turned the knob. In fact, the end result left him pleasantly surprised. There were light bulbs spaced several feet apart all the way down the stairwell. They might have been here since the 1950s, but at least there was light. Elias took a deep breath of the foul air and stepped through the doorway. The first stone step felt solid beneath his foot, despite its worn appearance. He pulled the door behind him, but left it cracked, not wanting anyone who might enter the boiler room to discover his trespassing. The staircase descended downward into darkness, far deeper than any basement had a right to go. As he began his descent, Elias had the distinct impression he was leaving more than just the known portions of the Somerset State Correctional Hospital behind. He was crossing a threshold between the world of rational explanation and something else entirely, something that existed in the darkest corners of the human mind, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. He continued downward, step by careful step, toward whatever awaited him in this subterranean world. Chapter 8. The Edison-style bulbs flickered like dying fireflies as Elias descended the narrow stairwell. Each step downward brought a noticeable temperature drop, as if the corridor actively rejected warmth. By the fifth step, Elias couldn't shake the distinct feeling that this wasn't just a basement. It was a threshold to something else entirely. The architectural blueprint he'd found weeks ago hadn't prepared him for the way the air seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his skin with almost sentient resistance. 19 days had passed since his discovery of that detailed rendering, tucked away among board games and patient artwork. 19 nights of interrupted sleep, where dreams of labyrinthine corridors and locked doors plagued him until dawn. 19 mornings of waking with the absolute certainty that Somerset State Correctional Hospital was hiding something beyond the mundane horrors of institutional neglect. Jesus Christ, he muttered as the temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. His breath formed visible clouds now, crystallizing in the stagnant air. The ceiling lights grew farther apart as he descended, creating pools of weak illumination separated by stretches of impenetrable shadow. The hospital administration hadn't bothered installing proper lighting down here. Why would they? According to official records, this place didn't even exist. The air itself seemed predatory. It clung to his lab coat and crawled beneath his collar, actively leaching heat from his body as effectively as an ice bath. This wasn't the familiar cold of winter or air conditioning. This was something that reached deeper, something that made his bones ache. Along with the cold came a smell that made Elias's nostrils flare in involuntary disgust. The sharp tang of ozone, layered over wet rust and something else, something organic that his brain refused to identify. Elias paused, his hand tightly gripping the ancient metal railing. An icy shock bit into his palm like a live wire, sending a jolt up his arm. The rational part of his brain, the part that had earned him his doctorate and reputation, tried desperately to catalog these sensations into something explainable. Temperature inversion, poor ventilation, old pipes leaking some industrial chemical. Anything but what his instincts screamed, that this place was wrong in ways science couldn't quantify. "Get a hold of yourself," he whispered. His voice sounded muffled, as if darkness swallowed sound just as efficiently as it consumed light. "You're a psychiatrist, not some low-budget TV ghost hunter." The stairs ended abruptly at a concrete landing. A single light bulb illuminated a heavy metal door, its surface coated with decades of dormancy. For a moment, Elias considered turning back. He could return to a somewhat normal life, pretend he'd never found that blueprint, and continue his career at Somerset treating the standard cases of psychosis and antisocial personality disorder that populated the official wards. He could choose a path of professional survival that Nurse Winters had advised. But that wasn't Elias Thorne. Instead, he pushed the door open, disregarding all rational thought, opting instead to satiate his overactive curiosity. In an attempt to maintain some shred of scientific composure, Elias reached for the pocket of his lab coat and retrieved his notepad and pen. His psychiatric training demanded documentation, objective observation, detachment. But his hands betrayed him, his fingers trembling so violently that the ballpoint pen slipped from his grasp. It hit the floor with a small metallic sound that echoed obscenely in the suffocating silence. Elias stared at it, lying against the stone floor like a fallen soldier, and decided to leave it there. Some rational part of his mind noted this as the first time in 15 years he'd willingly abandoned his pen, a gift from his father upon graduating med school. "Fuck the notes," he muttered. His voice sounded wrong, too thin and reedy against the oppressive weight of the air. The hallway stretched before him, illuminated by more of those ancient Edison bulbs, their filaments visible as they struggled against the darkness. The walls here weren't the institutional bone color of the upper levels, but raw stone, chiseled out of the earth decades before modern building codes. Moisture seeped through in places, creating dark streaks that resembled a network of veins. Elias continued forward, his footsteps creating wet echoes. The cold intensified with each step, seeping through his clothes like spectral fingers. The corridor widened into what could generously be called an antechamber. The ceiling vaulted upward into darkness where the feeble light from the ancient bulbs couldn't reach. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Elias's arms stand on end. But it was the wall on the right that commanded Elias's attention, making him forget the cold and the gloom of the space. 3 heavy steel doors stood in a perfect row, evenly spaced like sentinels. Each bore a number stenciled in chipped and faded black paint. 700, 701, and 702. Elias approached the first door, examining it with clinical precision that belied his racing heart. The construction was unlike anything in the main hospital. 3 inches of solid steel with reinforced hinges and a locking mechanism that looked more appropriate for a bank vault than a patient room. A small viewing port, no larger than a paperback book, was set at eye level, sealed with a sliding metal plate. These weren't treatment rooms. They weren't even isolation chambers used for violent episodes that existed in the main building. These were containment units of some sort, built not for rehabilitation, but for permanent nullification. Whoever, or whatever, had been kept here wasn't meant to improve. They were meant to be forgotten. Elias moved to door 701, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. The cold intensified dramatically as he approached, transitioning from uncomfortable to genuinely painful. This wasn't the ambient cold of the hallway. This was focused, emanating from the door itself like a beacon. It penetrated his lab coat, his shirt, his skin, drilling into his marrow with precision that felt deliberate. His training told him to step back, to process what he was experiencing. Temperature differentials like this weren't natural. Perhaps there was some sort of cryogenic equipment behind the door, though what purpose it would serve in a psychiatric ward he couldn't imagine. Or perhaps the room had an exterior access, and the autumn air was somehow finding its way inside. But neither explanation accounted for the directional nature of the cold, how it seemed to intensify the closer he came to this specific door. The viewing plate on 701 was different from the others. While 700 and 702 had simple sliding covers, this one featured an additional layer of iron plating, secured with what appeared to be newer screws. Someone had reinforced this portal specifically, sealing it more thoroughly than its neighbors. What were they afraid of seeing? Elias whispered, his words dissipating in small clouds. His hand moved toward the viewing plate as if controlled by an external force. The rational part of his brain screamed objections, that he was crossing professional boundaries, that he was trespassing in a restricted area, that he might lose his license if discovered. But those concerns seemed distant and unimportant compared to the gravitational pull of what waited beyond that small metal rectangle. His fingertips brushed the edge of the viewing plate. The metal felt wrong against his skin, not just cold, but somehow active, vibrating at a frequency just below conscious perception. It was like touching a tuning fork long after it should have gone silent. As he prepared to slide the cover open, something stopped him. Not a sound. The silence down here was absolute, a vacuum that devoured all ambient noise from the world above. It was, instead, a subtle shift in the quality of that silence. a whisper of movement in the darkness behind the door. Infinitesimal, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably deliberate. Elias froze, his finger still outstretched. His psychiatric training, his years of clinical detachment, his professional identity, all of it shattered in that moment of pure prime recognition. Something was in there. Something that, despite the passage of decades and the improbability of his survival in such conditions, was alive. And not just alive, but aware. He forced himself to grab the steel plate that covered the viewing window. Initially, he didn't think it would move. It looked almost welded in place. But it did. It slid open with ease, exposing a thick glass viewport the size of a paperback novel. Elias took a breath and bravely pressed his face against the glass. The darkness within was so absolute that it seemed to press back at him. For a moment, he saw only his reflection, cut and refracted by the scratches on the glass. He blinked hard, forcing himself to continue. At first, there was nothing. The interior of the cell was a black so complete it seemed to eat the light. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw that the walls were not smooth. They were grooved, patterned with deep, uneven gouges that ran in horizontal bands. Scratch marks, hundreds of them, layered over decades. The floor was bare, except for a scattering of indistinct lumps. Old rags, or perhaps remnants of bedding. In the farthest corner, where the light from the viewing window could barely reach, there was a shape. A tall human form facing the corner with its head tilted downward, as if in penance. It wore the shredded remains of a hospital gown, the fabric so thin and stained it clung to the bones beneath. It didn't move, not a twitch, not a breath. Elias stared for a full minute, waiting for the telltale rise and fall of the shoulders or the nervous shift of weight. There was nothing. The posture was unnatural, a child's punishment, but scaled up to something grotesque. The arms hung straight down, the hands lost in a curtain of fabric and shadow. The head was massive, elongated, its skull protruding at strange angles, like a creature whose bones had been rearranged for some despicable purpose. A sensation hit Elias, an impact, as if the air inside the cell had detonated without warning. He recoiled from the pain of a sudden pressure behind his eyes, a burning in the sinuses, and a metallic taste of blood on the back of his tongue. His first instinct was to pull away from the window, to break contact, but his body wouldn't respond. He was rooted in place, frozen by the force of something he could neither see nor comprehend. Chapter 9. The pressure built behind Elias's eyes until he thought his skull might crack open like an overripe melon. Blood vessels burst open in his sclera, painting thin red lines across the whites of his eyes as he remained paralyzed before the viewing port. It wasn't fear that held him in place. It was something more primitive, more absolute. The thing in the corner from room 701 hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched a finger. And yet, Elias felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against his consciousness, probing for weaknesses. His lungs burned for air, but his diaphragm refused to cooperate. Elias tried to scream as the pressure intensified, but the sound died in his throat. The darkness from the cell seemed to leak through the glass, reaching for him with tendrils of absolute black that defied the weak Edison lighting. And then, without warning, the figure in the corner moved. It didn't turn, it didn't straighten. It simply shifted. An almost imperceptible change in posture that somehow conveyed more menace than if it had lunged at the glass. Elias felt rather than saw the movement, a ripple in the heavy air that pushed through the barrier between them. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. Frost began to form on the inside of the viewing port in delicate crystalline patterns, beautiful and terrible in their geometric perfection. The cold penetrated Elias's skin, bypassing his nerve endings and driving straight into his bones. This wasn't the kind of cold you could endure. This was extinction level, the void between stars, the absence of all energy and life. His blood slowed to a crawl in his veins. His thoughts grew sluggish, fragmenting into primitive patterns of survival and surrender. As his consciousness began to fade, a white-hot light erupted behind his eyes. The physical world fell away, leaving Elias suspended in a formless void. The pain vanished, replaced by a disorienting sense of movement without motion. He was being pulled, not physically, but temporally, through layers of reality that human perception was never meant to navigate. The void collapsed around him, resolving into solid shapes and defined spaces. The cold receded, replaced by the tepid warmth of a steam-heated office. Elias blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden change in light. He was suddenly standing in a doctor's office, not his own, but one from a different era. The furniture was heavy mahogany, the desk cluttered with typewritten reports and medical journals bound in cracked leather. A calendar on the wall showed April 1953, the days neatly crossed out in red ink up to the 17th. 3 men occupied the room, utterly unaware of Elias's presence. Behind the desk sat a middle-aged doctor with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light from the brass desk lamp. His white coat was pristine, his posture rigid with the kind of authority that came from decades of unquestioned power. The name tag on his coat read Dr. Frederick Marsh. 2 security guards in navy blue uniforms stood before him, their caps held respectfully in their hands. "Gentlemen," Dr. Marsh was saying, his voice cultured and precise, "I called you here because we have a situation that requires discretion." He opened a manila folder on his desk, revealing a black and white mugshot paperclipped to the top page. "Charles W. Johnson, transferred here yesterday from county lockup after being declared unfit to stand trial. Diagnosis: acute catatonic schizophrenia with violent psychotic episodes." One of the guards, a burly man with a neck as thick as his head, leaned forward to examine the photograph. "Is this the guy that butchered his family? I read about him in the paper a while back. Slaughtered his wife and kids with a fire axe, right?" Dr. Marsh nodded, his lips pressed into a line of disgust. "He killed them in their sleep, first the wife, then the children. A 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. He cut them to pieces, then sat in the kitchen and ate breakfast while covered in their blood. When the neighbors came by to check why the children hadn't shown up for school, they found him sitting there, staring at the wall." "Jesus Christ," the second guard muttered, crossing himself reflectively. "And they sent him here instead of the electric chair? What the hell's wrong with these judges?" "My thoughts exactly, Mr. Peterson." Dr. Marsh removed his glasses and polished them methodically with a handkerchief. "The court psychiatrist testified that Johnson was experiencing a complete break from reality and wasn't cognizant of his actions. Apparently, that's enough to save a child killer from justice these days." The first guard spat on the floor, then looked embarrassed when Dr. Marsh raised an eyebrow. Sorry, Doc. This just turns my stomach. Quite understandable, Mr. Donovan. The doctor replaced his glasses and closed the folder with a finality that suggested a decision had already been made. Officially, Mr. Simmons is here for treatment and rehabilitation. Unofficially, he let the sentence hang, heavy with implication. Elias watched as a silent understanding passed between the three men. He wanted to look away, to reject what he was witnessing. But he was as paralyzed in this vision as he had been at the viewing port. This wasn't a dream or hallucination. It was too vivid, too specific in its details. It felt more like a memory, but not his own. "What exactly did you have in mind, Doctor?" asked Peterson, his voice lowered even though the office door was closed. Dr. Marsh smiled, a thin, clinical expression devoid of warmth. "I believe in balance, gentlemen. The courts may have been swayed by technicalities of mental incompetence, but we have a responsibility to the families of Johnson's victims, to society as a whole. Sometimes treatment must be rigorous to be effective." "You want us to rough him up," Donovan said bluntly. "Make his life hell." "I want you to administer appropriate corrective measures outside the standard treatment protocols," Dr. Marsh replied, his precise language a veneer of medical legitimacy over what they all understood was being proposed. "Nothing that can't be explained away as self-inflicted injuries, of course. Mr. Johnson does have violent episodes after all. Sometimes episodes like the ones he suffers from leave marks." "And if something were to happen?" Peterson asked. "You know, like an accident that occurs with dangerous patients all the time." Dr. Marsh's eyes hardened. "Nothing fatal, Mr. Peterson. Death would be too quick, too merciful for what this bastard has done. No, I want Mr. Johnson to experience the full course of treatment that Somerset can provide, for as long as possible." The scene blurred around Elias, time accelerating like a film reel running too fast. When it steadied again, he was in a utility corridor deep in the hospital's bowels. The concrete walls were damp with condensation, the overhead pipes dripping rust-colored water onto the floor. Donovan and Peterson stood over a figure curled on the ground. Charles Johnson, his hospital gown torn and stained, his face a mess of bruises. "Wake up, you piece of shit," Donovan growled, nudging Johnson with the toe of his boot. "We ain't done with today's therapy yet." Johnson didn't respond. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing while a thin line of drool leaked from the corner of his mouth. The catatonia that had overcome him during his crime had never fully released its grip. Even in the midst of the beating, he remained partially dissociated. Present but not present. "I don't think he's hearing you," Preston said, lighting a cigarette and leaning against the wall. "Lights are on, but nobody's home." He tapped the side of his head with his nightstick in a comical gesture. Donovan grunted in frustration. "That's what pisses me off the most. I can't even make the prick scream. It's like beating a sack of potatoes." He delivered a half-hearted kick to Johnson's ribs, then spat on the floor. "This is getting old, Pete. 3 weeks of this, and what's the point if he can't even feel it?" Peterson exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Maybe we need to try something with a bit more juice." He tapped his temple meaningfully. "Doc Marsh mentioned they've got that new electroshock set up in the East Wing. Said old Johnson here is scheduled for a session tomorrow morning." Donovan's face lit up with cruel interest. "Oh yeah? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking maybe our friend here needs a special midnight session. For his own good, of course." The scene shifted again. and Elias found himself in a treatment room that reeked of antiseptic and burnt hair. Charles Johnson lay strapped to a table, electrodes attached to his temples. His body heaved and convulsed as electricity coursed throughout his system, his back arching off the table despite the leather restraints holding him down. Donovan stood by the control panel, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he casually adjusted the dials. "How many volts we at now?" Peterson asked, watching Johnson's body jerk and twitch. 50 above the therapeutic recommendation, Donovan replied with a smirk. "But who's counting?" "Think he'll remember any of this?" Donovan shrugged. "Doc says probably not. The electricity scrambles the memory centers or some shit like that. But somewhere in that fucked up brain, he's feeling it. I guarantee it." They continued for hours, cycling the current on and off, pushing the voltage higher each time. Johnson never screamed. His body reacted, but his mind remained locked away in whatever sanctuary his broken psyche had constructed. As dawn approached, they reluctantly returned him to his room, his body limp and unresponsive, burn marks visible where the electrodes had been attached for too long. The electroshock sessions continued for weeks, supplemented by accidents during hydrotherapy, holding Johnson underwater for a few seconds too long, or making the water too hot or too cold. Nothing fatal, as Dr. Marsh had instructed, but nothing humane either. A living hell administered with clinical precision. But still, Charles Johnson endured. His physical body deteriorated, but his mind remained stubbornly unreachable. He neither improved nor declined significantly, existing in a twilight state that frustrated his tormentors. They wanted him to break, to scream, to beg. His passive acceptance was an affront to their vengeance. Then came the day Dr. Marsh decided on a more permanent solution. Elias watched in horror as Johnson was strapped to an operating table, a surgical team assembled around him. This wasn't a standard procedure. There were no observation students, no detailed records being kept. Just Dr. Marsh, a nurse who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, and an anesthesiologist who kept checking his watch. "The patient has shown no response to conventional therapies," Dr. Marsh dictated to no one as he marked incision points on Johnson's shaved scalp with a grease pencil. "Lobotomy is indicated as a last resort treatment for his uncontrollable violent tendencies." The nurse tentatively spoke up. "Doctor, shouldn't we wait for approval from the—" "Approval has been granted," Dr. Marsh cut her off sharply. "This procedure is entirely appropriate given the patient's history and current condition." The nurse fell silent, her eyes downcast. The anesthesiologist administered the bare minimum of sedation, enough to prevent movement, but not enough for complete unconsciousness. Elias realized with sickening clarity that this was intentional. They wanted Johnson aware. They wanted him to experience this violation of the brain in the most painful way possible. Dr. Marsh worked with mechanical efficiency, drilling small holes through the skull and inserting a specialized tool, a glorified ice pick really, that would sever connections in the frontal lobes. There was no artistry to the procedure, no careful mapping of brain regions. This wasn't medicine. It was mutilation disguised as treatment. When it was over, Charles Johnson was even more vacant than before, if such a thing were possible. The spark of awareness that had occasionally flickered in his eyes was extinguished completely. He existed now as an empty vessel, a breathing corpse that required feeding and cleaning but showed no sign of human consciousness. For 6 months he languished in this state, not improving, not dying, simply persisting as a walking reminder of institutional failure. He became an embarrassment to Dr. Marsh, whose promised treatment had produced neither rehabilitation nor satisfaction. The final scene unfolded in Dr. Marsh's office once again. The calendar now showed November 1954. Donovan and Peterson stood before the desk as they had that first day, but the atmosphere was different, tenser, more desperate. "We can't keep him in the main ward anymore," Dr. Marsh was saying, his fingers steepled before his face. "The new administration is implementing reforms. Outside inspectors will be touring the facility next month. Questions will be asked about his condition." "So what's the plan?" Donovan asked. "Transfer him somewhere else?" Dr. Marsh shook his head. "No facility would accept him in his current state without a complete medical history, and we cannot provide that for obvious reasons." "Could have an accident," Peter suggested, "not for the first time. Fall down the stairs, choke on his food." "And risk an autopsy?" "No." Dr. Marsh opened a drawer and removed a set of blueprints, spreading them across his desk. "Gentlemen, you are all familiar with the lower ward?" Both men shook their heads. "It was constructed during the initial building phase in the 1890s, but was decommissioned after the First World War. It's a subterranean level, completely isolated from the main facility, where they used to house the most dangerous, criminally insane, the ones deemed beyond our help or redemption." "And it's still accessible?" Donovan asked. "There's a service stairwell behind one of the heating boilers in the basement. The lower ward has been boarded off for decades, but the lock systems should still function." Dr. Marsh's fingers traced a path on the blueprint. 3 cells remain usable: 700, 701, and 702. Reinforced steel doors, complete isolation. An understanding formed on the guards' faces. "You want us to put him down there?" Peterson asked. "Just leave him?" "Precisely. No paperwork, no questions. As far as the hospital is concerned, Charles Johnson will have escaped during transfer to another facility. A tragic clerical error that allowed a dangerous patient to slip away. We'll file the appropriate reports, express the appropriate regret, and life will go on." "And Johnson?" Donovan asked. Dr. Marsh closed the blueprints with finality. "Nature will take its course. Without food, water, or care, the problem will resolve itself within a week, maybe 2, given his remarkable resilience. But resolve it will." 3 days later, in the dead of night, Charles Johnson was half carried, half dragged down the service stairwell to the lower ward. He offered no resistance as they opened the heavy steel door of room 701 and pushed him inside. His blank eyes registered neither fear nor understanding as the door slammed shut and the lock engaged with a heavy click of finality. "Good riddance, asshole," Donovan muttered as they retreated back up the stairs. The next day, workers arrived to board up the entrance to the service stairwell, concealing it behind a false wall that would remain undisturbed for decades. But Charles Johnson didn't die in the sense that we know it. While his body did expire from lack of nourishment, something else happened in that cold, dark cell, something that defied medical explanation. In the absolute isolation, in the absence of all stimuli, what remained of Charles Johnson coalesced into something else entirely, something that waited patiently in the darkness for 65 years, preserving its hatred, refining its purpose. The vision collapsed as suddenly as it had begun. Elias found himself lying on the stone floor of the lower ward corridor, curled into a fetal position before the door of room 701. His body ached as if he'd been beaten, every muscle screaming in protest as he slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position. The cold that had been so oppressive earlier now felt almost comfortable, familiar. He blinked, his vision adjusting to the dim light of the ancient Edison bulbs. Everything looked sharper somehow. The shadows deeper, the light more painful. As he rose to his feet with a fluid grace that didn't match his usual awkward movements, his fingers traced the metal door, lingering over the number 701 with something like affection. Elias turned away from the door and began walking toward the stairs that would lead back to the upper levels of Somerset. His gait was different, smoother, more deliberate, as if each step was a decision rather than an automatic function. The corners of his mouth twitched, then pulled upward into a smile that stretched too wide for his face. It wasn't Elias's usual tight-lipped professional expression, but something feral and hungry. As he ascended the stairs, leaving the lower ward behind, that smile remained fixed on his face like a rictus. His eyes, once merely tired and cynical, now gleamed with a cold intelligence that calculated every movement, every breath. The borrowed body moved with increasing confidence in each step. Whatever had taken control of Elias Thorne's body, whether it was the spirit of Charles Johnson or something altogether worse, was free to roam the halls of Somerset State Correctional Hospital. Chapter 10. Dr. Finch stood at the periphery of the cafeteria, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line as he observed the morning ritual with the detached interest of an entomologist studying insects. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the institutional bone-colored walls and the shuffling patients who lined up for their nutritionally balanced slop. He didn't need to be here. Overseeing roll call was beneath his position as medical director, but the petty exercise of power was sometimes the only thing that made these godforsaken mornings bearable. His polished Oxford squeaked against the linoleum as he shifted his weight, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Roll call should have started precisely at 7:30 a.m. It was now 7:33. Someone would hear about this lapse. Punctuality wasn't just a virtue at Somerset State Correctional Hospital. It was the framework that prevented chaos. And if there was one thing Alistair Finch couldn't abide, it was chaos. "Good morning, Dr. Finch." Nurse Winters approached with her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. That's what it was, really. A barrier between her and the walking repositories of psychosis that populated this hellhole. "Didn't expect to see you at the morning count." "Evidently," he replied, not bothering to hide his displeasure. "You're 3 minutes behind schedule, Nurse Winters." A flush crept up her neck, staining her pale skin. "I apologize, sir. The kitchen was late with the metal trays, and we wanted to make sure everyone had their breakfast before. The patient's comfort does not supersede protocol." He straightened his already impeccable tie. "Begin the count immediately." She nodded and moved to the center of the room. A portly guard with sweat stains already darkening his uniform joined her. The cafeteria gradually quieted as the patients recognized the familiar routine about to commence. "When I call your name," Nurse Winters announced, her voice carrying that practiced blend of authority and forced cheer, "please raise your hand and say present. Anderson, Thomas." A gaunt man with trembling hands raised one arm. "Present," he mumbled. "Speak up, Anderson," barked the guard. "Present." The patient's voice cracked with effort. Dr. Finch observed the pathetic display with disdain. These people were broken beyond repair, yet here they all were, playing at normalcy with their routines and rules. As if counting heads and serving nutritionally balanced meals could somehow contain the depravity of damaged minds. It was a theater, nothing more, but theater with purpose. Structure was a powerful sedative, often more effective than the chemical cocktails they pumped into these people 3 times a day. The roll call continued, a monotonous drone of names and responses. Dr. Finch's attention drifted to the staff positioned around the room. 2 orderlies by the food line, looking bored. A security guard at each exit. Nurse Winters and her sweaty companion at the center. All presented and accounted for, except... "Where's Davidson?" Dr. Finch interrupted, his voice slicing through Nurse Winters' recitation. She blinked, confused. "Sir?" "Guard Davidson. He was scheduled for the overnight shift and morning roll call. Where is he?" The portly guard, his name tag read Morales, cleared his throat. "Now that you mention it, I didn't see him at shift change this morning. Figured he was in the bathroom or something." Dr. Finch's jaw tightened. "And Kowalski, Edwards. They were on overnight as well." Morales and Nurse Winters exchanged glances, a silent communication that set off warning bells in Dr. Finch's head. I haven't seen either of them, sir," Morales admitted. "They never checked out at the end of their shift." A cold sensation crawled down Dr. Finch's spine, like icy fingers tracing his vertebrae. 3 guards missing, all from the same shift. It could be nothing. A card game that ran too late, a collective bout of food poisoning from the deplorable staff cafeteria. But Somerset wasn't a place where coincidences thrived. Coincidence implied randomness, and randomness was the enemy of the rigid order Dr. Finch had established. "Continue the count," he ordered, his voice betraying none of his concern. "Morales, get on the radio and check with the security desk. I want to know where those men are, immediately." The guard nodded and stepped away, murmuring into his radio as Nurse Winters resumed calling names. Dr. Finch watched the patients with renewed intensity. Did any of them seem different today? More agitated? More satisfied? The faces revealed nothing but the usual blend of medicated apathy and simmering resentment. Morales returned, his ruddy face pale now. "Sir, no one's seen them. Davidson's car is still in the parking lot, so he never left the facility." Before Dr. Finch could respond, a scream tore through the air, high-pitched, primal, the sound of someone encountering something their mind couldn't process. The patients stirred, a collective flinch rippling through the room. "Lock them down," Dr. Finch ordered, already moving toward the sound. "No one leaves this room." The scream had come from the east wing, where the medication storage was located. Dr. Finch's shoes slapped against the floor as he ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he could hear Morales shouting into his radio, calling for backup. The medication room stood ajar, a silver fluorescent light spilling into the hallway. From inside came the sound of retching. Dr. Finch pushed the door open, and the smell hit him first, a thick, coppery stench that coated the back of his throat. Then he saw the nurse, a young woman whose name he couldn't recall, doubled over and vomiting onto the pristine white tiles. And then he saw why. Guard Davidson, or what remained of him, was sprawled across the medication counter. His body had been systematically dismembered, limbs severed at the joints with surgical precision. His torso was splayed open like a grotesque anatomy lesson, internal organs displayed in a hideous parody of medical instruction. Blood had painted the walls, the ceiling, the shelves of medications, a crimson mural of violence that defied comprehension. Davidson's face was the worst part of it. It remained intact, frozen in an expression of wide-eyed terror, mouth stretched in a silent scream. His eyes, filmed over now in death, seemed to stare directly at Dr. Finch in mute accusation. "My God," Dr. Finch whispered. his clinical detachment momentarily shattered by the sheer brutality of the scene. The young nurse continued to retch, her slender body convulsing with each heave. Dr. Finch grabbed her shoulder, pulling her away from the carnage. "Who did this?" he demanded. "Did you see anyone?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Tears and mucus streaked her face, and her uniform was spattered with her own vomit. Morales appeared in the doorway, his radio clutched in his meaty hand. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, then immediately crossed himself. "What the fuck happened here?" "Get security," Dr. Finch ordered, his voice steady despite the horror churning in his gut. "Full lockdown, now. Every patient in their rooms, every door secured, and find Kowalski and Edwards." Morales nodded and backed out of the room, his eyes never leaving the grotesque tableau on the medication counter. The nurse had collapsed to the floor, curled into a fetal position, her body racked with silent sobs. Dr. Finch forced himself to approach Davidson's remains, his medical training taking over. The cuts were clean, made with something extremely sharp. Not a typical knife. The edges of the flesh were too precisely severed. A surgical implement, perhaps? And the arrangement of the body parts suggested purpose, not random savagery. The killer had taken time, had arranged this display deliberately. The overhead speaker cracked to life. "Code red. Repeat, code red. All personnel implement lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill." Dr. Finch left the traumatized nurse where she lay and stepped into the hallway where chaos had erupted. Staff members ran in both directions, some toward the medication room, others away from it. He grabbed the arm of a passing security guard. "Find the other missing guards," he ordered. "Kowalski and Edwards." "Sir, we just got a call from the maintenance level," the guard replied, his voice trembling. "They found Edwards in the laundry room." "Take me there." The maintenance level of Somerset was perpetually damp, the ancient pipes overhead leaking condensation onto the concrete floor. The laundry room hummed with the rhythmic thud of industrial washing machines, the smell of detergent unable to completely mask the underlying reek of institutional filth. A small crowd had gathered outside the door, faces pale, eyes wide with shock. They parted for Dr. Finch, no one speaking, no one meeting his gaze. Edwards had been stuffed into one of the industrial dryers, his body contorted to fit the confined space. Like Davidson, he had been dismembered post-mortem, his limbs twisted and broken to accommodate the circular drum. His head was positioned to face outward through the glass door, eyes bulging, tongue protruding between blue lips. Blood and other fluids had pooled at the bottom of the dryer. Someone had turned the dryer on. The drum rotated slowly, displaying Edwards like a macabre carnival attraction, his broken body tumbling almost comically. The mechanical timer clicked steadily, counting down minutes that Edwards would never see. Dr. Finch reached out and slapped the emergency stop button. The drum halted, Edwards' face frozen behind the glass in a grotesque death mask. "Who found him?" Dr. Finch asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the other machines. A laundry attendant stepped forward, an elderly man with gnarled hands. "I did, sir. Came down to start the morning loads and, he gestured helplessly at the dryer. "Wasn't nothing I could do for him." Dr. Finch's radio crackled. "Dr. Finch, to the hydrotherapy room." "Repeat, Dr. Finch to hydrotherapy." The voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Kowalski. It had to be. The hydrotherapy room was located in the oldest part of Somerset, a relic from the days when ice baths and water treatments were considered cutting-edge psychiatric care. Modern medicine had long since abandoned such practices, but the room remained, occasionally used for physical therapies for patients with certain injuries or conditions. 2 security guards stood outside the door, both visibly shaken. One was openly weeping, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. The other met Dr. Finch's eyes and shook his head slightly, a warning. "How bad?" Dr. Finch asked. "It's the worst thing I've ever seen, sir," the guard replied, his voice hoarse. Nothing could have prepared Dr. Finch for the scene inside. The hydrotherapy room contained 6 large tubs, designed to immerse patients completely. Kowalski had been distributed among all 6. His head floated in the first tub. The water turned pink with dissolved blood. Each limb occupied its own tub, arranged with the same clinical precision that had characterized Davidson's display. The final tub contained his torso, chest cavity splayed open, ribs cracked outward like the petals of some nightmarish flower. The water in each tub was perfectly still, not a ripple disturbing the surface. The room was silent except for the steady drip of a leaking faucet, each drop hitting the water with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the quiet. Dr. Finch stood transfixed, his medical mind cataloging details even as his human sensibilities recoiled. The cuts were identical to those on Davidson, clean, precise, surgical. This was methodical butchery, executed with skill and patience. Not the work of a frenzied psychotic, but something far more disturbing. Calculated, purposeful savagery. And there was something else. Something he'd missed at first. Floating beside Kowalski's head was a small folded piece of paper, the edges already softening in the water. Dr. Finch grabbed a pair of forceps from a nearby tray and carefully extracted it, unfolding the sodden sheet. It contained a single word, written in what appeared to be blood. Compromised. The cold realization hit him with physical force, driving the air from his lungs. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't even the work of a deranged patient. This was a message, and he needed to make sure the authorities understood exactly what they were dealing with. Dr. Finch backed out of the room, his mind racing. He needed to reach his office, needed to call not just the local police, but the state authorities, possibly even federal. Whatever had breached Somerset's security wasn't something that could be handled by a few county deputies with sidearms. His office was on the 3rd floor, a sanctuary of order in the midst of institutional chaos. Dr. Finch took the stairs, unwilling to wait for the elevator. His legs burned with exertion by the time he reached his floor. The corridor was deserted, all staff presumably occupied with lockdown procedures. He unlocked his door with trembling hands and went straight to the phone, punching in the emergency number reserved for major security breaches. It rang only once before being answered. "This is Dr. Alistair Finch, medical director at Somerset State Correctional Hospital," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I need to report a code black. 3 security personnel are dead, murdered on the premises. The facility has been compromised. I repeat, Somerset has been compromised." The word felt strange on his tongue, too close to the blood-scrawled message floating in the tub with Kowalski's severed head, as if the killer had anticipated exactly what Dr. Finch would say, exactly how he would respond. "I understand, Dr. Finch," the voice on the other end replied. "Containment protocol is being initiated. Secure yourself in your office and await further instructions." Dr. Finch replaced the receiver, a chill setting into his bones. containment protocol meant no one in or out, not even emergency services, until a special response team had arrived. Somerset was now completely cut off from the outside world. He moved to his window, looking out at the sprawling grounds of the hospital, the high perimeter fence topped with razor wire. Beyond that, miles of dense forest separated Somerset from the nearest town. They were isolated, trapped, and somewhere within these walls was someone or something that had systematically dismembered 3 trained guards and displayed their bodies like grotesque art installations. Dr. Finch returned to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, removing the small revolver he kept there against regulation. He checked that it was loaded, then placed it on the desktop within easy reach. All he could do now was wait and wonder what would happen next. Chapter 11. The tactical vehicles cut through the morning fog like black sharks, their engines growling low as they approached Somerset State Correctional Hospital. The decaying facade of the institution stood in stark contrast to the sleek, armored SWAT vehicles that pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, a study in despair versus precision. Inside each vehicle, men and women in full tactical gear performed final equipment checks. Kevlar vests snug, weapons loaded, comms tested. They'd received the call 20 minutes ago. Multiple homicides and an unknown perpetrator still possibly on the grounds. The vehicles came to a stop, and the rear doors burst open with rehearsed efficiency. 8 operators from each vehicle deployed in synchronized movements, their boots hitting the ground with muffled thuds as they established a perimeter. Lieutenant Walsh, a 20-year veteran with hard eyes and a vertical scar bisecting his left eyebrow, motioned for his team to regroup beside the lead vehicle. "Listen up," Walsh said, his voice low but carrying to every member of the team. 3 confirmed dead inside, possibly more. Hospital security has locked down all patient wings. But we'll treat every individual we encounter as a potential threat until confirmed otherwise. Standard room clearing protocols. We're going floor by floor, methodical and thorough. Sergeant Rodriguez, the team's second in command, unfurled the hospital blueprints across the hood of the tactical vehicle and secured them against the morning breeze with her forearm. She traced possible entry and exit points with a gloved finger. Her movements were economical and focused. The main entrance here gives us the most direct access to the central corridors. Alpha Team takes the east wing. Bravo takes the west. We clear each floor completely before moving up. Radio check every 5 minutes, she instructed, her eyes never leaving the blueprint. The team nodded in unison, their faces grim beneath tactical helmets. Their breath formed small clouds in the morning air as they checked weapons one final time. The metallic clicks of safeties and soft rustle of movement were the only sounds in the parking lot. "Command post established here," Walsh said, pointing to their current position. "Chen, Monroe, you're on comms and perimeter. Everyone else move out." The team approached the main entrance in 2 staggered columns, MP5 submachine guns held at low ready, eyes scanning every window and doorway for movement. The faded brick exterior of Somerset seemed to absorb their presence, the building itself an unwelcoming sentinel with decades of misery seeping from its pores. The glass doors slid open with a tired hiss as they approached. Inside the foyer, the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant failed to mask an underlying scent of mildew and decay. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, several flickering in an irregular pattern that cast strange, shifting shadows across the worn linoleum floor. A security guard with Morales embroidered on his uniform pocket stood waiting near the reception desk, his face ashen, right hand trembling slightly as it hovered near his holstered sidearm, which was actually a taser, not a gun. His eyes widened at the sight of the tactical team, and relief washed over his features. "Thank Christ you're here," Morales said, stepping forward to meet Walsh. "It's a fucking nightmare in there." Walsh moved toward him, signaling for the rest of the team to maintain position and secure the entrance. "What's the situation?" Morales swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed beneath the tight collar of his uniform shirt. "I was in the cafeteria during roll call when I heard the screaming. By the time I got to the scene..." His voice cracked, and he paused to steady himself. "There was blood everywhere. Fucking everywhere. Like someone was playing with them before they died." Rodriguez stepped forward, her face impassive behind the tactical visor. "Are all patients secured?" "Yeah," Morales nodded quickly. "That's standard protocol. As soon as we realized what was happening, we initiated full lockdown. Every patient is locked in their rooms. Even if power fails, those doors stay locked. We've got skeleton staff monitoring from the security room on the first floor, East Wing." "Any staff unaccounted for?" Walsh asked, already motioning for his team to prepare to move deeper into the building. "Dr. Finch is holed up in his office on the third floor. Won't come out. Won't answer his phone. And we can't locate Dr. Thorne." Morales wiped sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand. "There's at least one more body on the third floor. Nurse Miller. Found her about 20 minutes ago when we were doing a head count for lockdown." Walsh processed this information with a curt nod. "We'll take it from here. Stay at the entrance. Coordinate with our perimeter team." He turned to his operators. "Alpha Team, East Wing. Bravo, West Wing. Maintain radio discipline. First floor first, then we move up systematically." The team split at the central junction of the hospital's main corridor. Alpha Team, led by Walsh, moved with fluid precision down the eastern hallway, each operator covering specific sectors as they advanced. Bravo Team mirrored their movements down the western corridor, Sergeant Rodriguez at its point position. The hospital's interior matched its exterior in decay. Peeling paint, water stains spreading like disease across the ceiling tiles, and the constant drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the distance. Their boots squeaked against the linoleum as they methodically checked each room, the sound obscenely cheerful in the oppressive atmosphere. Alpha Team had encountered the first crime scene 10 minutes into their sweep. The staff break room door stood ajar, a streak of dark crimson smeared across its surface like a grotesque welcome sign. Walsh signaled a standard entry formation, and 3 operators stacked against the wall beside the door. The point operator used the barrel of his weapon to push the door fully open, then pivoted into the room, weapon raised. The others followed in practiced sequence, covering all angles as they entered. "Holy shit," someone muttered over comms. The break room had been transformed into a tableau of horror. A body lay sprawled across the central table, his chest cavity splayed open like a grisly science experiment. 2 nurses were positioned in chairs on either side, their bodies contorted into unnatural postures, as if attending some macabre tea party. Their faces had been rearranged. There was no other word for it. Features had been removed and repositioned with sickening precision. "Clear," the point operator called out, voice tight but professional. Walsh keyed his radio. "Alpha to command. First scene secure. 3 victims confirmed deceased. Notify forensics to prioritize this location when we give the all clear." He paused, surveying the carnage with clinically detached eyes. While Alpha Team documented the scene and continued their methodical room clearing, Bravo Team moved through the western wing in identical precision. They discovered the second crime scene in the medication dispensary. A security guard slumped against the medicine cabinet. His body was carved to pieces from what could have been from a frenzied attack. His face frozen in an expression of disbelieving agony and mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Bravo to command. Second scene located. One victim. Similar signature. Rodriguez reported, her usual unflappable demeanor showing the first hairline cracks as she surveyed the brutality before her. The teams converged at the central stairwell to move to the second floor. No one spoke as they ascended. The weight of what they'd witnessed settled around them like a shroud. The second floor yielded nothing beyond empty offices and treatment rooms until they reached the eastern corridor. There, in what appeared to be a hydrotherapy room, they discovered the third scene. 6 pools of water, each with dismembered body parts floating in it. Alpha to command. Third scene located. 1 confirmed casualty, another dismemberment, Walsh reported, and signaled for the team to move on. When both teams reached the third floor, they encountered the first resistance. Dr. Finch's office door was locked. A handwritten "Do Not Disturb" sign taped haphazardly to its surface. Walsh knocked firmly, announcing their presence. "Dr. Finch, this is Lieutenant Walsh, Tactical Response. We need you to open the door." A muffled whimper came from inside, followed by a shaky voice. Go away. He'll kill me too if I come out." Walsh exchanged glances with Rodriguez. "Sir, the building is being secured. We need to verify your safety." "No! He's still here. I can feel him." The voice dissolved into incoherent muttering. Walsh signaled to a team member who stepped forward with a compact battering ram. One swift strike and the door frame splintered, allowing them access. The office behind was a study in controlled chaos. Papers scattered across every surface, books pulled from shelves and stacked in precarious towers. Dr. Finch himself cowered beneath his desk, a small revolver clutched in his white-knuckled hands. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his shirt, and his glasses sat askew on his nose. Please, he stammered, the gun trembling wildly in his grasp. He's not human. What he did to them, no human is capable of that." Rodriguez stepped forward, her weapon trained on Finch, but her voice deliberately calm. "Sir, I need you to place the weapon on the floor and slide it towards me." Finch shook his head frantically. "You don't understand. He was right here, in this room, smiling. He was smiling when he told me what he'd done." A sob escaped him. "He said I was next, that he was saving something special for me." Walsh made a quick decision. "This guy's in shock." He gestured to one of his operators. "Chambers, stay with him. Try to get a description if he calms down. Everyone else with me." The teams left Chambers behind with the gibbering doctor and continued their methodical search, finding no other casualties on the third floor. The corpse of the missing nurse, Nurse Miller, had already been discovered by security. She had been positioned in a patient's bed in one of the private rooms, made to look like she was sleeping, save for the neat surgical incisions across her throat and wrists. After clearing all 3 main floors, Walsh gathered the team at the central stairwell. Nothing. No sign of the perpetrator on any secured floor. He turned to Rodriguez. "What about the basement level? Maintenance, storage?" Rodriguez consulted the blueprint. "Single access point near the central elevator bank. Primarily mechanical rooms, boiler, electrical, some storage areas." She looked up. "It's not on the lockdown system. Those doors would still be accessible." Walsh nodded grimly. "That's our next target. Full team, standard formation. If the perp is still in the building, that's where he'd probably go to ground." The stairwell leading to the basement was poorly lit with emergency bulbs casting sickly yellow pools of light on concrete steps worn smooth by decades of use. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, the air growing heavy with moisture and the acrid smell of mildew. At the bottom landing, Walsh held up a closed fist, signaling to the team to halt. In the dim light, a dark smear was visible along the wall beside the basement door. A handprint, fingers dragging downward, rendered in tacky, half-dried blood. "Fresh," Rodriguez murmured, crouching to examine a droplet pattern on the floor. "Within the last hour." Walsh keyed his radio. "Command, Alpha. We have blood evidence indicating suspect movement to the basement level. Proceeding with caution. Maintain perimeter integrity." The basement corridor stretched before them, lined with pipes running along the ceiling, some dripping condensation that echoed in the confined space. The team moved forward in practiced formation, each operator scanning assigned sectors as they advanced. The first 3 rooms, electrical, janitorial storage, records archive, yielded nothing beyond decades of institutional neglect. But as they approached the boiler room at the far end of the corridor, the blood trail became more pronounced. No longer just droplets, but long smears, as if something heavy had been dragged. Walsh signaled a standard breach formation at the boiler room door. The point operator tried the handle, unlocked, and pushed the door open slowly, leading the way with the barrel of his MP5. The boiler room was cavernous, dominated by 2 massive industrial boilers that hissed and groaned like tormented beasts. The blood trail led between them, toward the far wall, where it disappeared behind the second boiler. Walsh signaled for the team to spread out, covering all angles as they followed the grisly path. Behind the second boiler, partially concealed by decades of accumulated debris, was a small door, no more than 4 feet high, its surface covered in faded maintenance warnings. The blood trail ended directly at its threshold, a large, sticky pool congealing on the floor. Walsh gestured for his team to take positions. "We breach on my mark." As the breaching specialist moved forward with his equipment, the rest of the team established a semicircle around the door, weapons trained on the small opening, fingers resting lightly on triggers. The basement fell silent except for the rhythmic clanking of the boilers and the team's controlled breathing inside their tactical helmets. Whatever lay beyond that door, they would face it with the same precision and professionalism that had carried them this far. Walsh raised his fist, about to give the signal to breach, when a sound emerged from behind the small door. Not a voice, not a movement, but something between a sigh and a whisper, like air escaping a long-sealed chamber. Apprehension filled each member of the team as they collectively perceived what lay beyond this door would be something that none of them had ever encountered or imagined before. Chapter 12. The stairwell wound down like a spiraling gullet, swallowing the SWAT team whole as they descended deeper into Somerset State Correctional Hospital's bowels. Lieutenant Walsh led the way, his tactical boots landing with muted thuds on concrete steps that grew damper with each turn. The air changed as they moved downward, became thicker and stale, like it hadn't been properly circulated in decades. Thin, yellowed Edison bulbs dangled from fraying wires at irregular intervals, casting more shadows than light. Walsh had cleared buildings, bunkers, and drug dens in his 15 years on the force, but something about this descent into the hospital's bowels made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. "Jesus Christ, it stinks down here," Mendoza muttered from behind his tactical mask, the words barely audible over their synchronized footfalls. "It's like something died, and nobody bothered to clean it up." Something probably did, Carter replied, her voice tight with tension. This place is older than fuck. Walsh turned and gave his team a quick look that said, "Shut your faces." The concrete walls gave way to rough-hewn stone, like they'd transitioned from a man-made structure to some ancient cave system. Dark patches of moisture seeped through in places, forming abstract patterns that looked disturbingly like faces in the dim light. Their flashlights cut jagged beams through the darkness, illuminating suspended dust particles that seemed to dance away from their light rather than within it. "How much deeper does this go?" Petrovich whispered, breaking protocol. Nobody reprimanded him. They were all thinking the same thing. The landing opened into a wider chamber with a high ceiling. 3 steel doors, massive and institutional, were set into the stone, each marked with a faded 3-digit number: 700, 701, and 702. Like the primitive stone surroundings, these doors were ancient and looked like immovable pieces of rust. Walsh shifted his focus and saw him. A man in a lab coat stained dark with blood, scratching at the door labeled 701. His movements were frantic, almost spasmodic, as he clawed at the rusted steel, muttering incomprehensibly to himself. "Police, freeze! Hands where we can see them!" Lieutenant Walsh barked, his voice rebounding off the walls with sudden authority. The man, Dr. Elias Thorne, according to the blood-spattered name tag clipped to his lab coat, didn't acknowledge them. He continued his manic interaction with the metal door, his shoulders twitching with each failed attempt. His hair was plastered to his forehead with what appeared to be a mixture of sweat and blood, and more blood had dried in flaking patches on his neck and hands. "Jesus," Mendoza breathed, his flashlight beam illuminating what they hadn't initially noticed: a body on the floor beside Dr. Thorne, partially hidden by the doctor's frantic movements. The body belonged to another man in a lab coat, though his was nearly shredded across the chest and abdomen. The fabric was saturated with blood, some still seeping from multiple wounds that looked like they'd been inflicted by a blade. Jagged, viscous cuts had torn through the cloth and flesh with equal savagery. Despite the grievous injuries, the man's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements. Alive, but barely. The most disturbing part was his face. Eyes wide open, bulging with terror, mouth frozen in a silent scream. He wasn't unconscious. He was watching Thorne with an expression of such primal horror that Walsh felt his own stomach turn. The horror this man had experienced had broken something fundamental inside of him. "Dr. Thorne," Walsh tried again, taking a cautious step forward, his weapon trained on the doctor's back. "Step away from the door and put your hands above your head, now." This time, Thorne paused. His shoulders stiffened, and he slowly turned his head. Just his head, keeping his body angled toward the door, as if afraid to lose contact with it. The face that looked back at the SWAT team didn't belong to any sane person Walsh had ever encountered. Thorne's eyes were bloodshot to the point where the whites were nearly crimson, the pupils dilated to black holes. A grotesque smile stretched across his lips, revealing teeth smeared with blood. "I have to let him out," Thorne said frantically. "He's awake now. It's time to set him free." "Final warning," Walsh said, his fingers tensing on the trigger. "Step away from the door and get on the ground." Dr. Thorne's smile widened. "You have no idea what's beyond this door, what I've awakened, what I've become." Saliva dripped from his mouth as he yelled. With unexpected swiftness for a man of his build, Thorne reached into his lab coat and pulled out a large kitchen knife, its blade dark with blood that gleamed wetly in the flashlight beams. "Drop the weapon!" Walsh shouted. But Thorne was already lunging toward them, moving with unnatural speed, the knife slashing in wide, frenzied arcs. Walsh had his finger on the trigger, ready to put Thorne down, but Petrovich moved faster. The taser leads shot out with a pneumatic hiss, embedding themselves into Thorne's chest. The doctor's body convulsed violently as 50,000 volts coursed through him. The knife clattered to the stone floor, and Thorne followed a second later, his limbs twitching uncontrollably. "Suspect down," Mendoza called out, moving in with restraints while Chen kept his weapon trained on Thorne. "Get those cuffs on tight," Walsh ordered, kneeling beside the wounded doctor on the floor. "This guy's strong as hell and completely out of his mind." Walsh knelt next to the injured man on the floor, partly to assess his status, partly to let the poor bastard know that help would arrive soon. The name tag on his blood-stained lab coat read, Dr. William Kelly. He slowly reached up with a trembling, frail hand, a gesture pleading for mercy. "Hang on, buddy," Walsh said, holding the man's hand. "The medics are on their way." Walsh barked into his radio. "We have one critical, multiple stab wounds, possible punctured lung. Suspect is subdued and in custody. Get a medical team down here now. We're in a sub-basement level. The door is behind one of the main boilers." "Copy that," the dispatcher's voice crackled back, sounding distant and faded in the underground chamber. "Medical team coming in now. ETA 4 minutes. "He might not have 4 minutes," Walsh muttered, applying pressure to what looked like the worst of the wounds, a deep gash across the abdomen where viscera threatened to spill out. Dr. Kelly continued staring into Walsh's eyes. Behind him, Thorne had stopped convulsing and was now laughing softly. The sound muffled as Mendoza secured him face down on the stone floor. "You're too late," Thorne said, his voice suddenly different, deeper, resonant in a way that made the air feel heavy. "He's seen you all now. He knows you're here." "Shut the fuck up," Mendoza growled, clenching the restraints tighter than procedure dictated. Nobody called him out on it. With Thorne secured, Walsh became aware of a strange sensation emanating from door 701. It wasn't a sound exactly, or even a feeling. More like a presence pressing against his consciousness. He found himself unable to look directly at the door for more than a few seconds without experiencing a wave of inexplicable dread that made his heart race and his mouth go dry. "Lieutenant," Chen said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, Do you feel that?" Walsh nodded slightly, not trusting himself to speak. They all felt it. A tangible malevolence seeping from beyond that steel door like toxic gas. The air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, as if viewed through heat waves, though the chamber was bone-chillingly cold. "We should check what's in there," Carter said without conviction, making no move toward the door. Walsh found himself involuntarily looking away from the rusted steel door. In 15 years on the force, including 7 with SWAT, he'd never retreated from anything. He'd faced down armed suspects, entered buildings rigged with explosives, and stared into the eyes of men who killed for pleasure. But something about that door made his instincts scream with primal warning. "Negative," he heard himself say. "Secure the scene and wait for backup. Nobody approaches that door." No one objected. They all maintained their positions, weapons still drawn, eyes darting between Thorne, the wounded doctor, and, reluctantly, door 701. The injured doctor made another attempt to speak, his bloodied hand clutching desperately at Welsh's arm. This time, he managed to force out a single word, his voice a raspy whisper that nonetheless carried clearly in the chamber. "Run!" Thorne began to laugh again. the sound rising in pitch until it resembled a scream more than laughter. "You can't run from what's already inside you," he said, twisting his head at an uncomfortable angle to fix Walsh with his blood-red gaze. "He's seen all of you now. He knows what you fear, what you desire, what you're capable of. You all belong to him now." A low, vibrating hum seemed to emanate from door 701, just at the threshold of hearing. "What the fuck?" Petrovich whispered, raising his weapon toward the door. "Hold position," Walsh ordered, though his own voice betrayed his unease. "Medical team will be here any second." But even as he said it, his radio crackled with static. When he tried to call for an update, he received only garbled noise in response. The comforting connection between the world above had been severed. The humming from the door intensified, and the temperature in the chamber plummeted suddenly, their breath fogging in the air. The wounded doctor began to convulse, his back arching unnaturally as blood frothed from his mouth. "He's coming," Dr. Thorne whispered, his voice thick with reverence and fear. Walsh made a decision. "We're evacuating, now. Mendoza, Carter, grab Dr. Kelly. Petrovich, Chen, transport the prisoner. Move." No one questioned the order. They moved with desperate efficiency, hoisting the wounded doctor between them, dragging the still laughing Thorne to his feet. As they backed toward the stairwell, Walsh kept his weapon trained on door 701. Just before they reached the stairs, he could have sworn he saw the heavy steel door move. Not opening, but bulging outward, as if something massive on the other side was pressing against it, testing its strength. "Move, move, move," Walsh shouted, taking up the rear as his team scrambled up the stairs, their earlier careful descent forgotten in the face of primal fear. Behind them, the humming grew louder, and the quality of darkness changed, becoming thicker, more substantial, as if it were a physical presence following them up the stairs. Walsh had never been a religious man, but as he climbed those stairs, putting distance between himself and whatever lurked behind door 701, he found himself silently reciting fragments of prayers from his childhood. Based on the moving lips of his team members ahead of him, he wasn't the only one. They'd come to subdue one man. Instead, they'd brushed against something that defied explanation, something that, despite their weapons and training and body armor, had reduced them all to frightened children fleeing from the dark. Chapter 13. Dr. Alistair Finch's office was a sad affair of institutional furniture and dreary beige walls. It was nothing compared to the disaster spread open on his desk. Patient file number 1138, Elias Thorne, lay before him like a grotesque autopsy of professional failure. Every page, every note, every evaluation form screamed of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs. Finch rubbed his bloodshot eyes, the skin beneath them sagging from months of interrupted sleep and pharmaceutical assistance. How many times had he reviewed this file since the massacre? 50? 100? Didn't matter. No amount of retrospective analysis would bring back the people Thorne had butchered with surgical precision while Finch had cowered under his desk, pissing himself and clutching a pistol he had no idea how to use. The overhead fluorescence hummed with the same frequency as the guilt that vibrated through Finch's bones. A year. It had been just over a year since that day, and still the memories arrived with such visceral clarity that he sometimes found himself checking his clothes for blood and piss that wasn't there. He flipped to the mandatory psychiatric evaluation he'd performed on Thorne 3 weeks before the incident. His own clinical handwriting mocked him from the page. Subject displays above-average stress responses to work-related stimuli, but remains within acceptable parameters for his position. No indicators of violent ideation or psychopathic tendencies observed. No indicators, Finch muttered, a bitter taste flooding his mouth. You fucking idiot. The photograph clipped to the inside cover showed Dr. Thorne as he had been then. Immaculately groomed, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his aquiline nose, lips pressed into what passed for a professional smile. Nothing like the wild-eyed creature who had stalked the halls of Somerset State Correctional Hospital with a kitchen knife, collecting body parts like some demented taxidermist. Finch's stomach churned as his mind replayed the moment he heard the first scream, the high-pitched wail of the nurse who had discovered the first victim. I could have stopped this, Finch whispered to the empty room, the words hanging in the stale air like a confession. I knew something was wrong with him. I fucking knew it. Finch had noticed little behavioral tics, but chalked them up to the eccentricities of a brilliant mind. He had even commended Dr. Thorne's dedication in staff evaluations, citing his willingness to pursue unorthodox approaches to treatment-resistant cases. Now, with a year's worth of hindsight and 5 corpses in the ground, none of it seemed to matter. A soft knock on the door pulled Finch from his self-flagellation. Nurse Reynolds, one of the new hires, still unscarred by the horrors of long-term psychiatric care, stood in the doorway, her face carefully arranged into what passed for professional concern. Dr. Finch, sir. They're ready to admit the new patient. Finch nodded, closing Thorne's file with hands that trembled just enough to notice. Thank you, Reynolds. I'll be right there. She hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more, to offer sympathy or curiosity or whatever emotion seemed appropriate for when one's colleague was about to face the man who nearly destroyed their institution. But whatever courage had brought her to this door failed her, and she retreated with a quick, tight smile. Finch rose from his desk, his bones creaking like an old house settling. When had he gotten so damn old? 58 wasn't ancient, but the past year had added decades to his frame. He straightened his tie, smoothed his lab coat, and grabbed Thorne's file before stepping into the corridor. The fluorescents overhead flickered and buzzed, their harsh light washing out what little color existed in Somerset's bland palette of bone and beige colors. The sound of his leather Oxfords echoed against the linoleum, each step amplified in the heavy hallway. This wing had been cleared for Thorne's arrival. No patients, minimal staff, maximum security. The corridor stretched before him, reminding Dr. Finch of a throat swallowing him deeper into the hospital's gut. Doors lined the passage, each marked with a number and a small window reinforced with wire mesh. Behind them, Somerset's residents existed in various states of chemical sedation and psychological distress. Finch had spent decades treating patients like them, believing he was doing good work, making a difference. Now he wondered if he'd just been warehousing the unwanted, applying band-aids to a gaping wound in the human psyche. He passed the staff room, where a television murmured news no one cared about, to empty chairs. Past treatment room C, where electroconvulsive therapy was still administered to the most resistant cases. Past the pharmacy window, where Nurse Davidson dispensed little cups of oblivion to the properly authorized. The corridor ended at a security checkpoint, new since the incident last year. A guard with shoulders like granite slabs checked Finch's ID and badged him through to the elevator bank. Finch stepped inside, awaiting the car, pressed B3, and ascended into the bowels of the Somerset. The admittance room awaited him at the end of another soulless corridor. It was a space designed for processing, not comfort. A clinical rectangle where new patients were stripped of possessions, dignity, and any lingering notions that they were still full citizens of the world. The room reeked of institutional bleach and something deeper, more primal. The smell of human fear soaked into the concrete and metal over decades of use. Cement floors gleamed dully underneath the lights that seemed to flicker in time with Finch's pulse. The walls, painted institutional green sometime during the Nixon administration, had peeled in several places to reveal layers of previous colors: asylum beige, sanitarium gray, like geological strata of misery. Metal lockers lined one wall, their surfaces dented and scratched from the tantrums of patients who suddenly understood what was happening to them. A row of reinforced windows high on the far wall offered a view of Somerset's outer perimeter. Guard towers and razor wires silhouetted against the sky that had the good grace to be appropriately gray. 6 chairs were bolted to the floor in the center of the room, arranged in a loose circle for the admission interview that would determine initial treatment protocols. A metal desk occupied one corner, stacked with forms in triplicate and topped with a computer old enough to be considered vintage in any other setting. Dr. Matthews, a younger psychiatrist with a tightly trimmed beard and anxious eyes, stood beside the desk, clutching a clipboard like it might shield him from whatever was coming. 2 guards positioned themselves near the inner door, their massive frames suggesting they spent their time off bench-pressing small automobiles. Security Director Rollins paced near the outer door, his hand resting casually on his holstered taser. "Is the room secure?" Dr. Finch asked, though the answer was obvious. Rollins nodded. "We've got 4 armed guards in the corridor, 2 more at the elevator. Transport team is en route with the patient. ETA 5 minutes. Patient, not prisoner, not murderer, not monster. Patient. The clinical terminology created an illusion of normalcy that the situation did not warrant. Elias Thorne was returning to the medical system that had failed to identify him as a threat. But this time, he was entering through a different door, not as a colleague, but as an inmate. "His restraints?" Finch asked, aware that his voice had acquired a slight tremor. "Full protocol," Rollins replied. "Handcuffs, ankle chains, waist chain, and the mask." The mask. A contraption borrowed from law enforcement, designed for prisoners who bit. A rigid plastic muzzle that prevented the wearer from sinking teeth into flesh. It had become standard procedure for violent offenders after an incident 3 years ago when a patient had torn out an orderly's throat with his incisors. Finch nodded, taking a seat at the metal desk. He arranged Thorne's file before him, opened to a fresh page, and uncapped his pen. The mundane actions steadied him, allowed him to pretend this was just another admission, not a confrontation with his own monumental failure. A buzzer sounded, harsh and insistent. Rollins checked the security monitor, then unlocked the outer door. "They're here." The transport team entered first. 2 corrections officers in body armor, faces set in expressions of professional detachment. Between them, shuffling with the restricted gait of the heavily shackled, came Elias Thorne. Finch's breath caught in his throat. The man before him bore little resemblance to the distinguished psychiatrist who had once shared journal articles and professional gossip over coffee in the staff room. This creature was gaunt, his prison jumpsuit hanging from shoulders that protruded like wire hangers. His formerly well-kept hair had grown long and lank, framing a face that seemed to have collapsed inward around the eyes that burned with feverish intensity. The mask covered the lower half of his face, but it couldn't conceal the most disturbing change. Thorne's eyes. Once an unremarkable brown, they now appeared almost amber in the harsh lighting, with flecks of something that seemed to catch and reflect light in ways human irises shouldn't. More unnerving was the awareness behind them, the calculating intelligence that assessed the room and its occupants with predatory precision. Those eyes found Dr. Finch, and the recognition was immediate. The skin around them crinkled in what might have been a smile beneath the mask. Finch's mouth went dry. He had rehearsed this moment, had prepared clinical responses designed to establish boundaries and authority. But facing Thorne, seeing the man who had left 5 colleagues dead and 3 others maimed for life, all his carefully constructed professional detachment crumbled. "Secure the prisoner to the block," Rollins ordered, and the transport team guided Thorne to the central restraining area, securing his chains to steel loops embedded in the floor. This was the part where the patient is stripped naked and thoroughly searched and disinfected. Finch chose not to be a part of this. Seeing Elias upon his entrance would be enough. Hopefully he'd never have to see Elias Thorne again, though protocol dictated that all new patients were to be placed on suicide watch for the first 30 days of their placement. The risk of an attempt was statistically higher during the first month. Dr. Thorne chose to ignore that policy. His hope was that the fucker would wrap a bedsheet around his neck and do himself in the middle of the first night, a solution that would relieve a lot of people employed at Somerset. Finch didn't turn to give Thorne a parting look. He just nodded to Rollins, who buzzed him through the security door and into the corridor, where he finally allowed himself to gulp air like a drowning man breaching the surface of the water. The walk back to his office passed in a haze. He nodded to colleagues who spoke words he didn't hear, navigated hallways on autopilot, and finally collapsed into his chair. Those eyes. Jesus Christ, those eyes. They weren't the eyes of a man he'd known, the colleague had worked alongside for a short time. Something had happened to Elias Thorne. Something beyond the psychological break that had turned a respected psychiatrist into a killer. Finch had seen that same unnatural gleam before, in a patient who'd claimed to be possessed by something ancient and hungry. He'd diagnosed the man with schizophrenia, had increased his antipsychotic medication, and had dismissed the yellow flecks in the man's irises as curious but an irrelevant anomaly. That patient had hung himself with his bedsheets 2 days later, leaving only a note that said, "It's in the silence." Finch rose on unsteady legs and moved to the massive safe that occupied the corner of his office, a relic from Somerset's early days when patient files were considered sensitive enough to warrant such security. The combination came automatically to his fingers, 173642. The heavy door swung open with a groan of aged metal. Inside, alphabetically arranged in metal trays, were the files of Somerset's most dangerous residents, the ones whose conditions were too disturbing or whose crimes were too heinous for the general filing system. Finch placed Thorne's folder in the appropriate slot between a serial arsonist who claimed flames spoke to him and a former judge who'd murdered his entire family during what he described as a divine instruction. He stared at the row of folders, human tragedies reduced to paper and ink, and felt a wave of futility wash over him. What was he doing here? What good was he accomplishing? Was Somerset truly a hospital, or just a warehouse where society stored its broken and dangerous members? With a sudden surge of revulsion, Finch slammed the safe door shut. The lock clicked into place with mechanical finality, securing not just Thorne's file, but the evidence of Finch's professional and personal failures. As he turned back towards his desk, he caught his reflection in the window, a middle-aged man with haunted eyes and slumped shoulders. For a brief, disturbing moment, he thought he saw flecks of amber in his own irises, but he blinked and they were gone. Just a trick of the light, nothing more. Well, you've made it to the end. Thank you, sincerely. This story meant a lot to me since it was something that I had in my head since childhood. I'm glad I was able to finally write it and hand it over to the world. I hope it gave you a chill, or at least a moment of entertainment. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be putting up new stories and interesting horror-related content all the time. Also, please visit my website, chilledbones.com, where you can find more free stories and information about my latest novels. Make sure you take a look at my Dire Harvest series. I'm particularly proud of that one. Plus, I'm working on book 4 as we speak, so make sure you're ready for that. I'm Robert Ference, and this is Chilled Bones.